Hey, everybody, tune in to Recent Tartarians.
Recent Tartarians. Recent Tartarians. Recent Tartarians. Recent Tartarians.
Hey, everybody, tune in to Recent Tartarians.
Recent Tartarians. Recent Tartarians.
What up, everybody? Welcome back to the show. Let me move my microphone. I forgot how this works. Hey, everybody. It's Andreas. I want to say a special shout out to Omega Point Research. That's Donald. He has a channel that you guys should check out. He does both math and drumming, which technically is the same thing, but there's ways that he does it differently. And yeah, you'll enjoy his music, and you might even learn something. So check out and like and subscribe to Omega Point Research. Also, I saw that Islam Illusion was here. The Illusion was doing a live stream yesterday, but the power was out, back and forth. So I'm going to have to check it out more today. But just, you know, everybody support each other. I'm glad you guys are all here working together. I wanted to talk today about Bosniaks and the Croatians, and I don't think I'm going to do it. I was thinking it would be like a lot of work. I'm probably going to do it tomorrow. And instead I'll talk about the CIA. But I do want to show you some stuff. Here are my Gia Jogas, Yoga Joes. And I love these guys. They're doing their like yoga. And it connects a lot more to the CIA. And eventually you will understand why I wanted to take a second to really focus on the Janissaries later. Because the Croatians, it's just a lot. It's a lot to talk about. Bosnia, Turks, Ottoman rule, you know, and there's some stuff I didn't get to yesterday that I felt like I really needed to talk about more, particularly, for instance, you know, yesterday, let's just to recap, we're talking about Vienna being this party city, and Karl I, everybody who's there, you got Franz Josef's dying, Franz Ferdinand is dead, Karl I is the new king, emperor, prince boy. You've got Adolf Hitler. You have, Stalin, Lenin, Trotsky, blah, 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 blah. But what I didn't even think to mention was, like, Jung and Freud. I feel like at the beginning I might have said their names. But it's important to remember also you've got the religious, psychoanalytical religion forming in Austria. And there's so many things about that matter. Bernays into American psychology, into mind control in the CIA. You know, all of it connects to the religion forming from Freud in Vienna at that time. And he's considering it like a religion, you know, and we talked about how he wrote this Akhenaten Moses thing. Originally, one of the first people to openly talk about Moses being Akhenaten or Osarseph, the connections being made, was Freud. And then Jung says to Freud, you know, you're a dirty old man, and it could just be you're a product of your environment, I think was the politest way he put it. And then Freud laughed, smoked his cigar, did a line of cocaine, looked around his stripper club in Vienna and said, if only that were true. You know, because he wouldn't want to believe that he was like a sexual deviant just because he was from Vienna. However, you know, again, have you been to Vienna? So that's an important aspect of the story. Jung takes over. Let me see if I can find the 7 Sermons of the Dead really quickly here. Battle of Basra, 7 Sermons of the Dead. Connecting again to the 7 Sermons of the Dead. This is a book from well, I think it is connected to the Nag Hammadi Dead Sea Scrolls. I think. Written by Basilides of Alexandria, 7 Sermons of the Dead, collection of 7 mystic or, quote, Gnostic texts written and privately published by C.G. Jung. 1913, after the breakup with his one-time colleague Sigmund Freud, Jung began a personal exploration of the psyche, and he called to confront the states. He wrote the Black Book. Today you can buy his Red Book. His family finally allowed publishing. And you can see, you know, when he started getting really excited about Gnosticism and his fabrication of new Gnostic documents based on Nag Hammadi scrolls. Okay, well, that's something to look at, but I want to also make sure, let me see this also. Am I doing this right? That's something to bring up today. I think we're going to bring up that. Battle of Basra is something we didn't talk about yesterday either. Brave 4 is wrong. How do you turn this off? There's something wrong there. There we go. And then this guy replaced this window. See, I'm going to figure this all out. It's going to be great. Okay, so, and again, you can get these t-shirts. Let me fix this. Scaling. It's always fun to redo everything. Preview scaling. Canvas. Is that going to work? That seems about right. Is that right? No, this is wrong again. It's amazing I can't ever figure out how to do this right. It's sad. Move window capture. Add window capture. Window capture. So this is great also because you can learn how to do this stuff on your own. Because you'll be like, hey, he learned how to do it. It's possible. Okay. T-shirts by Exertis. Move it up there. Does that work? Something like that. And then it's also just way too big, which is annoying. But okay, whatever. You see the point. I've got a shirt show. You can buy my shirts. Yesterday, someone wanted the Croatia shirt. It is on sale right now. You can get yourself the V-neck version if you like, or you can get yourself the classic tee. And, again, someone's saying, oh, I couldn't afford $14. I think it was 22 or 36 or something for like the more expensive shirts. But you can get a mug. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to, it's possible. Stickers too. Stickers are pretty cheap. And I wanted to thank some people because yesterday someone went to Andreas.me and they went and they supported the donation page on Andreas.me. So that was rad. Whoever of you, I think it was like 3 people signed up to do the donation thing. I appreciate that a lot. That was really cool of you. Okay. Also, I haven't done news in a while. I might as well do just a really quick little bit of news. News will make people happy to know what the real world's going through. So let me just show you a little bit about the world, shall I? Make sure this is clear enough that you can read it. There we go. Axis of the Ordinary. One of my favorite guys, Alexander Krull, doing AI observation. He's talked a little bit about nuclear energy and decarbonization being used by corporations recently. There was a few other things I wanted to specifically show you. After Flamingo and Gato, new steps towards AGI. DALL-E 2 has now a secret language that's happening. And birds, they're studying birds. Stained glass windows being designed by robots. Here's why, because mosaics. And this is a new thing that's starting to emerge is stained glass windows designed by AI. It's going to be the value of empiricism, being able to make shapes out of relative pieces. That's a huge human condition. Democratic jackdaws use noise to make decisions. So here's the thing about herd intelligence. We're finding that birds are using noises to decide when it's not cool to leave. When enough of them made enough of this noise, they kind of are voting on that noise, and they will get up and go based on the noise. So there's some interesting thing about jackdaws in Cornwall and how they move. Life's first peptides may have grown on RNA strands. It seems like ribonucleic acid's pretty obviously the most important aspect of life right now. I mean, we talk about geology. In creation of biology, I mean, it's all about the peptide and the amino acid unfolding. So turns out that they could have actually helped one another. Claudia Bonfio, a junior group leader at the Institute of Supramolecular Science and Engineering in Strasbourg, France, who wrote a commentary that accompanied the paper. Studies have shown that the raw material for both peptides and RNA would likely have been present at the start of life. So this paper takes the view, why should we just focus on RNA? The work opens up new directions to explore the origins of life, says Yitzhak Tor, a professor of chemistry and biochemistry at the University of California, San Diego, who was not part of the study, but is a longtime collaborator with the authors. Now, you need to consider the interplay between two different biomolecules. It's a highly intriguing demonstration, says Andrea Rios, a research scientist at the Blue Marble Space Institute of Science and NASA Ames Research Center. The findings also explain a major chicken and egg conundrum that has bedeviled researchers studying life's origins. How did proteins form before the evolution of the ribosome, the cellular machine that churns out proteins in modern cells, when the ribosome is partly made up of the protein itself? This is a real, so next time someone asks you, which came first, the chicken or the egg, which is a stupid question because the egg came first, then you can ask them a more interesting question, which is which came first, the protein or the ribosome? If you ask which came first, the protein or the ribosome, and you say it kind of like that, which came first, the protein or the ribosome, then they'll immediately get what you mean is chicken or the egg, except you're not stupid because you know that the egg came first. I think that's fair. Okay. That's something to consider. Living fossils are ribosomes actually hold up data in geological, I guess you could almost say a construct. So they are living fossils, and they can also activate chemical reactions, which, though not really a fossil, we can use as records. So pretty fascinating. These ribosomes slide over the receipts to read them and assemble the amino acids that correspond to each step, with each of their amino acid suppliers molecules called transfer RNA, or tRNA, that continuously dive in as the process unfolds. The ribosomes transfer a growing peptide chain onto each new amino acid brought in by the tRNAs. These chains get longer and longer and eventually fold into functional proteins. It's unlikely, however, that proteins formed in a similar way 3.5 billion years ago. The bonds that hold the peptides on the tRNA molecules are rather weak. Without a ribosome available to provide shelter, water molecules would break these bonds before peptides could form, making the process unfeasible in the harsh, watery conditions of the primordial world. But most people are focusing on recreating the familiar process of protein translation as simpler forms, said Thomas Carroll, senior author of the new paper and the chair of organic chemistry at Ludwig Maximilian University of München. What if ancient translation looked very different from its modern form? Carroll and his team started to dig into this idea, looking for stronger bonds that may have survived in primordial conditions. That's how they zoned in on the often overlooked molecules called the non-canonical nucleotides. The genetic code of RNA is typically written with just 4 bases: adenine, guanine, cytosine, and uracil. But nucleotides with other bases are present in many RNA molecules that do other jobs, including helping with protein production in the ribosome. These unusual nucleotides can attach to amino acids with a chemical bond that's much stronger than the one that attaches amino acids to the tRNA molecule. See, did you know that DNA wasn't even totally hexadecimal, but actually works on quantum computational lines? I think that's fascinating. So a new way to build peptides. All life today uses ribosomes to make peptides, but eons ago, RNA alone might have done it in a newly discovered process, right? And this is how it looks. That messenger RNA encodes the receipt for a peptide here on this train track, and then tRNA transfer RNA supplies the amino acids here, growing in the peptide chain. And then the ribosome, which is there to read the mRNA along the train tracks, and then observes the peptide chain being produced, is added to new amino acid. The process repeats until the complete peptide is released, and then we're used to that. That's ribosomes. Now, but possible primordial peptide synthesis. Here's the Darth Jurassic Park fusion mix. Amino acids bond when 2 strands of modified RNA are brought close enough together. And then donor RNA and acceptor RNA are swirled together in this crazy when mommy and daddy love each other way. And when heated, the bond breaks, right? It just snaps open because it's quantum computation. So the distance has to do with heat. And one amino acid pops over to the acceptor strand because of some chemical reaction, just causing it to just explode. And then peptide chains grow through cycles of heating and cooling, and that's how mommy and daddy made you. So it's kind of exciting to think that there was really this alternative, I like that. In 2018, Carroll and his team reported that the classic nucleotide and the non-canonical nucleotides likely all evolved at the same time before the dawn of life. Okay, well, you gotta get the idea. The point is, it's plausible. There are non-canonical Star Wars episodes, so why not DNA, Here's another thought. Wild animals evolving much faster than previously thought, which is adorable because I know we were talking on Adam's show at one point about the monkeys in Madagascar and in Malaysia who were used as slaves for Costco to get coconuts. And this was, actually I should just... Coconuts, monkey, slaves. Let's go to the coconuts, monkey, slave story. Okay, and this is just annoying. Why is my window so small? What has happened here? I'm gonna switch this window instead because it just shouldn't be like that. Coconut monkey slaves. Yeah, there we go. There you go. That's more like it. Okay, so coconut monkey slaves, move it right here. Snatched, chained, and tortured. Monkeys forced to farm. Dude. The Vegan Review. Is your coconut milk really vegan? Monkey slavery. Want to see some pictures? Monkey slavery. Chained up monk. Dun, dun, dun. This is like, the funny thing though is, this was horrible. Don't get me wrong. Chaining up a monkey to get coconuts, that's terrible. You should never chain up a monkey. You should never chain up anybody. And this guy feeling like a freak on a leash much? Like, what do you think you're doing here? Like, what's he doing? Like, he's still there. He's still standing around. He just has a monkey picking up coconuts and he feeds them fruit. So at a certain point, though, they realized they didn't need the humans as much anymore because the monkeys figured out what to do and they were happy to get their food. But the monkeys also got stressed out and they had drug addictions and they were drinking a lot. And these parts aren't jokes, people. Like, they literally were, they give them drugs, they give them alcohol, they give them whatever it takes. And the monkeys themselves, this is their life. This is what they do. And eventually vegans protested, which is fair, to be honest. Vegans and British liberals who were saying this was wrong. And I kind of agree. Wait, used for sex? I don't even really want to go too deep into that. I just wanted to know that this was something PETA's been telling us. Hey, monkey slavery. Well, but the point of this, the reason I bring up your monkey slavery situation is because monkeys aren't dumb. Monkey slavery. Monkeys are actually able to work jobs and roll cigarettes, and they can hunt, and they can work together. They can rob. I've seen monkeys rob people around town, and then they have like a stash up at the top of a hill or at the top of a building. A bunch of monkeys are working together under some kingpin monkey to steal from you. I don't think people realize what monkeys are like. They're a lot like humans. They're just like humans. But monkeys are evolving quicker because of this, because they're being trained. You've got monkeys that can wicker weave baskets for fishing now. I don't know if I'm getting it across to you, but training monkeys to make wicker baskets is a slippery slope to AI taking over. I just don't know what else to tell you. And it's going to be more like I don't know. It's complicated because eventually humans will decide, like in India right now, monkeys and elephants have rights because they're living beings. So who knows what's going to happen, but the real thing that I'm telling you that I'm concerned about, actually, is that they took the jobs away from them. I mean, a bunch of people freaked out about monkeys having jobs, being slaves. I mean, granted, they're feeding them, so it's not completely nothing, but, they took the jobs away from the monkeys. And now you've got all these out-of-work monkeys. And monkeys without jobs are actually worse, I think, than monkeys that find crime. That's what a monkey without a job has become. And there's just no running around and having a good time for these monkeys anymore. They are changed, and so this is why you have to be careful about uplifting monkeys and animals in general. Oh boy, wild animals evolving much faster than previously thought. The raw material for evolution is much more abundant in wild animals than we previously believed, according to new research from the Australian National University, ANU. Darwinian evolution is the process by which natural selection results in genetic changes. Why are they not talking about Teilhard Chardin? Since we're going to be talking about fools, let's show pictures of brilliant men. Okay, so Teilhard Chardin, an actual scientist, unlike Darwin, who wasn't obsessed with, he was a Catholic, so I can't say he wasn't obsessed with the occult, but he was a far closer scientist than anyone, he's way more interesting than you realize. He makes, I don't even want to compare, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Bill Nye, all those people, they're on the wave of fool. And then this is a genius. You know what I mean? So yeah, make sure you understand Chardin, 1,000 years ahead of the man. People are still catching up with Chardin. So I'm not even going to quote him right now. We do, we don't need to. We just know that this Darwinian thing was a joke. Let's move on. Led by Timothy Bonnet from ANU, an international research team wanted to know how much more of this fuel of evolution exists in wild animal populations. He answered 2 to 4 times more than previously thought. So I don't know if they're talking about midichlorians here, but according to Dr. Bonnet, the process of evolution that Darwin described was incredibly slow. However, since Darwin, researchers have found... Oh, wait, I got a new super chat. Brittany sent a super chat about Cord Meyer. Cord will be the more of the point of this, and I have an interesting video to show you actually from C-SPAN that is, talking about Cord Meyer's wife having an affair with JFK, and that's why his picture's on the cover. And just again, Cord Meyer will be something we talk about today, but just I want you to get this is Cord Meyer, America. Just like a little bit of a before we talk about news, a little bit of why we care about Cord Meyer, CIA. Wild. Look at his beautiful, bright-eyed, just open optimism there, right? That's Cord Meyer. Yeah. Well, his wife and Kennedy and assassinations and just all the crazy stuff that happened with the CIA and 2001: A Space Odyssey, controlling the media, church committee hearings. It all comes back to Cord Meyer. I think Cord Meyer is one of the most. It's weird because when you're a spy, it's a little bit easier to be forgotten. It's amazing of all people in history to be forgotten though. You don't want to forget this man. For America, right? You want to remember Cord Meyer. Even if you don't love him, but if you if you're American, you can love him. That's what's hilarious thing about being an American. It's crazy. All right, well, Cord Meyer, dangerous man, worth looking into. We're gonna talk about him more. Keep doing the donor box thing. Where was I at? Oh, yeah. Boom. No. Wild animals, DNA. Since Darwin, researchers have identified examples of Darwin evolution occurring in just a few years. A common example of fast evolution is the peppered moth, which prior to the Industrial Revolution in the UK was predominantly white, but then pollution leaving black soot on trees and buildings, black moths had a survival advantage. And everyone, this is where Christians are like, oh, well, that's just microevolution. Well, that's really all there is. Let's be real. Like, Christian evolution is the only actual kind of evolution. There's not a lot of, butterflies turning into men, except for in, like, Lao Tzu philosophy. So, just to be real, but it's something that will have a mutation. That's a pretty big one, right? I mean, if something turns black. Now, we could talk about microevolution in terms of, did it turn black because a bunch of white butterflies mated with black butterflies because of the advantage of, or was it, how did that one black butterfly emerge? Was it just a completely random mutation, or was it a conscious mutation? And that's where you get into Chardin, and you start to wonder about conscious evolution, where, people are working their whole lives on becoming a person. Does that person affect the next generation? The answer is obviously yes. I mean, we can show you studies of that, and this is also why animals who have been left in nature are able to quickly adapt and able to, quote-unquote, evolve, change, make breeding decisions mutually with their partners, and become new species, almost. Not completely new species, right? We're not turning butterflies into dogs, but we are seeing gradual affected change to a goal, to an end, which is, I think, you could almost call this Calvinist evolution. I don't know if Calvinists would like that, but I'm sure at least 6 of them would laugh. So the team of 40 researchers from 27 scientific institutions used studies of 19 populations of wild animals from around the world. These included superb fairy wrens in Australia, spotted hyenas in Tanzania, song sparrows in Canada, and red deer in Scotland. We needed to know when each individual was born, who they mated with, how many offspring they had, and when they died. Each of these studies ran for an average of 30 years. Okay, so it's a decent longitudinal study. Not bad. Providing the team with an incredible 2.6 million hours of field data, Dr. Bonnet said. Or Bonnet, I don't know what they like. We combine this with genetic information on each animal, studied to estimate the extent of genetic differences in their ability to reproduce in each population. After 3 years of trawling through reams of data, Dr. Bonnet and the team were able to quantify how many species change, how much species change occurred due to genetic changes caused by natural selection. The method gives us a way to measure the potential speed of current evolution in response to natural selection across all traits and population. This is something we have not been able to do with previous methods, so being able to see so much potential change came as a surprise to the team, said Dr. Bonnet. Professor Losk Krook, also from ANU and now based at the University of Edinburgh in the United Kingdom, said, this has been a remarkable team effort that it was feasible because researchers from around the world were happy to share their data in a large collaboration. That's something important to talk about another day, is how research data on the blockchain is like really saving the world and fighting insurance companies, which is the same thing. It also shows the value of long-term studies with details monitoring of animal life histories for helping us understand the process of evolution or adaptive change in the wild. However, the researchers warn us it's too early to tell whether the actual rate of evolution is getting quicker over time. For one reason is that we don't really know anything about anything from before 30 years ago at all. Anything you think you know from 30 years ago is either a lie or a fool trying to understand something, almost every case of the way, until you get like 300 or 400 years ago, before people started trying to use this flippity-gimmit science thing. And then they because you got to remember, science is very new. We've got billions of years of existence, maybe thousands of years of Christian ideology, and then you've got a couple hundred years of science, and every major problem we have seems to stem from science. You could say religion, but then look at malaria. So it actually goes back further. Okay. InfoWars, you know what? I don't even have anything to read from here. I just wanted to, I was like, where do you go to find news? Like, who cares? I mean, I was like, oh yeah, InfoWars and Al Jazeera and things like that. And so that's adorable. And I'm not even going to bother reading from it. I just wanted to do this because I thought it was funny. Yeah. So do that. And then also the Duran, if you guys want some more news, you can always find real news at the Real Duran. And you can learn all about what's really going on in international politics. This is the one that looked kind of hilarious to me after they dropped their hate crime symbols from the Azov uniforms. A lot of Azov guys were sent to war tribunals in Russia, and they have a new unicorn LGBTQ patch. So these guys are going to try to avoid going to Russia by replacing all their hate symbols with this new unicorn LGBTQ patch, which is pretty funny. Right, there you go. It's also not that... I don't know how to put it. It's not that rainbow. You know what I mean? So if that's supposed to, this is supposed to be a pride patch? I don't know. Good job, guys. You guys are really trying. I appreciate that you try. Okay, that's sad. Well, okay, so Cord Meyer. Brittany said again, Cord Meyer is the man I've wanted to see exposed forever. No idea this was today's topic. Dude, this is going to be like a week-long thing and probably a never-ending thing. We should make it like a thing where we just make fun of Cord Meyer. So I want to just kind of give you a little preface because I'm going to show you a video. And that's going to be a big part of Cord Meyer being reviewed by CIA newspaper, C-SPAN things going on. But let's just do like a quick, like Cord Meyer. Let's do like a really quick, like a wiki it up. Like, who's Cord Meyer? Like, is that a guy? Does he really exist? Like, what is Cord Meyer anyway? What does Cord Meyer mean to you? Okay. So, Jr. was a U.S. Central Intelligence Agency official, Cord Meyer Jr. After serving in World War II as a Marine officer in the Pacific War, handsomely, where he was both injured and decorated, when he lost his eye. Oh, I have to go turn off that ringing phone. Sorry about that. The worst thing is like when you can hear your phone alarm going on for an hour in the background. Okay, so lost his eye. I'll just show you a picture again because it can tell the story probably faster. You just see his face. Lost his eye. Continued becoming more and more old, running America, friends with Louis C. Clark, George H.W. Bush. Of course, like deep in the CIA. And, yeah, okay, so there you go. And right on Wikipedia, he was married to Mary Pinchot from 1945 until 1958. And we can look at her and say, my word, what a beautiful woman, like JFK's 46th birthday party. JFK's 46th birthday party. So, romantically involved with JFK after her divorce from Meyer. So you can see I'm not just telling you this. This is an everybody knows kind of thing that was going on. And you might wonder a bit about JFK, and you might have, some of you who don't know, you're like, I heard some stuff about JFK, but what's the deal with the Bay of Pigs, right? And the Bay of Pigs is the thing where the CIA was really a lot of guys with a lot of money who were involved with the CIA, rich families from Yale whose families owned properties, which were sugar mining plantations in other island countries, not technically part of the United States. And this is, again, the DuckTales comic book all about that, where he finds a star fort on an island and he turns it into his own economy so he can avoid Duckburg economy, right? So it's the same story. It's exactly, DuckTales is covering CIA Bay of Pigs situation. Anyway, the Bay of Pigs, are they going to say the Bay of Pigs invasion? And you can look into the Bay of Pigs invasion. I'm not going to make this all about Cuba today. That's a whole other thing. But just so you know, Cord Meyer's very important here. Kennedy did not help the CIA families, the families of CIA officers and agents who had cousins with huge, sugar plantations and things like that. And so they took it as a personal insult by Kennedy, and this is another reason why Cuba became the CIA experiment. And a lot of people will tell you, they were trying to kill Che Guevara. Well, I don't really believe that. I think that the CIA loved the opportunity of Cuba because they created an isolated CIA-controlled Soviet state. And granted, the Soviet Union was still there, and they had to deal with that all the time. But it was the CIA controlled it in so many ways. And I know a lot of people don't want to believe that. They're like, oh, no, that's impossible. Cuba was free. Buddy, nothing's free, And so like the Cuban diaspora, you've got all these great Cuban wealthy family people escaping the United States. You can think of Desi Arnaz. And, he was a mafia-associated fascist, right, who cleaned parakeet cages in Florida before he ended up running Hollywood. And Frank Sinatra's wife saved his life one time because he had played an Italian on television, which you weren't supposed to do if you were Cuban. And the way they made Italian gangsters look offended some Sicilian gangsters and Italian Americans who said, we probably don't want to be looked at that way. Like a bunch of guys who just kill people. We don't just kill people. We got to kill this guy. And that's what they ended up saying about Desi Arnaz. And then they said to save his life because Frank Sinatra's wife said, leave him alone. Don't kill Desi Arnaz. He's a nice guy. And like for whatever reason, they let him live. Okay. So that's one of your little stories about Frank Sinatra and Desi Arnaz and the Bay of Pigs. Another day we can go into how he saved her from being caught as being a communist because she was a double. Lucille Ball was a double agent communist. And I have episodes on, if you watch my PSY sci-fi series, I've got a couple episodes where we talk about the communist parties that were being thrown in Lucille Ball's houses in Hollywood, in Bel Air, I think, was where they had the parties. So that way they were able to throw these. And she said, I didn't know they were having parties at my house. I wasn't even there half the time. Okay. So anyway, Cord Meyer, though, controlling the Bay of Pigs. And all of a sudden, they didn't have the American support that they needed to have. They looked at this as an American Revolution. And there's some more there. I don't want to go too deep into the CIA's connection to the Jesuits quite yet because it's just so much more interesting. It's not that I don't want to talk about it, but suffice it to say, the Bay of Pigs is also a Jesuit plot as much as it is a CIA plot. You can't really say that this was just, that this was just the CIA giving up on Cuba, or rather the CIA trying so hard to take Cuba back and losing it into the American government just going with it. No, I mean, a big part of this was liberation theology, was the idea that communism would work in some future version that was separated and isolated from the Soviet Union. And so they kept trying all these ideas. But the Bay of Pigs is considered to be, by a lot of people, one of the major fiascos that led to the CIA not loving JFK. And I think the other one is Cord Meyer's wife leaving him, to have these romantic affairs. Now, they say this was after the divorce, which is so funny. Because no, it wasn't. No. Like, I don't mean to laugh, but let's be real. Like, there's no fidelity in Washington, D.C., dude. Like, no. So she was getting involved with Cord Meyer a lot. Cord Meyer had witnessed this himself, which was, imagine being a spy. You see everything. So he saw his wife, and he didn't. And the other thing is with the president. So and she probably had affairs with other guys, and this happens in the military. Guys go off for a long time, and we would have affairs, and then they play this beard for their CIA husband, and it can be kind of sad. She attended Brearley School of Vassar College, where she became interested in communism. There's so much more to this story. You can look into, did he marry the wrong woman on purpose because he was interested in a woman who was interested in communism? Opposites do attract. Or was he literally there in order to find out who these Pinchot families were? Wealthy Progressive Party people that funded socialist magazine The Masses. Could it be that this was all part of the plan? I would say with Cord Meyer, the likelihood of him militarized conspiring to marry someone rather out of agenda than love is at least a possibility. Okay. So Marine Corps, Pinchot married Cord Meyer in 1944, involved with world government, two pacifist views. The two had similar pacifist views in police and world government. Not really. But they both were authoritarians, let's be real. Like, both in real life, they're both authoritarians and fascists. She was a leftist fascist. He was a slightly more right-wing leftist fascist. But really, you could say theosophic and into liberation theology and connected with the Jesuits. There's a lot there. So she had control over media services, and he was fascinated by media control, and wanted to be involved with media control. And this became one of his major agendas at the CIA, was to make sure that the CIA controlled media. They wanted to make sure everyone had the media he wanted them to have. But then, as time went on, Joseph McCarthy publicly accused Cord Meyer of being a communist, right? And this is where, the McCarthy trials were always told, oh, communism. And what we don't really understand is how much bigger the international international CIA socialists were than the communists. So what my interpretation of this is that nobody understood communism properly. Marx didn't know what it really meant. I mean, Engels, and I talked to you just briefly about this yesterday, but Engels was a textile owner, right? And textile factory owner. So managerial theory made its way into Marxism. Managerial theory. And the idea that we could get rid of entropy and we feed people out of horse troughs will save money. And if we put fluoride and antibiotics in the horse trough, then they won't get sick. And if we mind control their children and educate them, take the children from the parents early on. Don't let the parents destroy these kids. We're going to educate them, make sure they don't have drugs. We're going to have a whole new generation of workers. So for the elite, communism is the ideal solution. And this is something I've said so much around the world in communist countries, and it bums them out, because I'll be like, yeah, I know, as an American, I see communism as the mode. America is very much a Marxist managerial state, and they're like, what do you mean by that? And then they've all been to school. You have to understand, you go to any country, you got university educated kids, right? So they all realize this is true. It's just, it bums them out, because you want to believe that communism is this, like, it's a bunch of guys working together. You want to believe American propaganda. You do. It's just fun to believe in nonsense. But at the end of the day, we know that the guys involved, these political theorists, were large textile factory owners and propagandists. Okay, another important person to remember, and this is all, again, Owenism, relates back to Owenism. Owenism was arguably more important than Marxism. Marxism definitely has a lot of its tenets, but Owenism literally was its managerial theory with utopian cooperative community. So the idea that automation would make food ubiquitous, that eventually we would have this is the New Harmony community. Starfort designed new communities in the United States that would be Owenist, and it would have a resource-based economy, and everyone would be educated. It's essentially based on the medieval monastery idea, right? Because in a monastery, you have authoritarian church that forces everyone to do certain things if they want to be part of the community. And it's a bit more complicated, but that is what a monastery was. That's essentially what Owenism was trying to do, build these beehive worker states where you have the elite in the highest commands eventually sort of become part of the group because they have an agenda. But yeah, no, I mean, the point is that this is true Marxism. When people talk about Marx, they don't really understand Marx. And for the most part, what we're practicing is a form of Owenism. And Owenism, at very least, is what the CIA have been trying to push for a long time. Reaction to laissez-faire impetus of the Malthusian poor reform, and this caused people to die. And you can look at George Bernard Shaw, who was a psychopath and a hedonist, etc. But he was also a writer who supported socialism, and he wrote a book called "The Intelligent Woman's Guide." God, my keyboard's all. I gotta get a new computer. Intelligent Woman's Guide to Socialism, or at least I get a new keyboard to type to connect to my laptop. That'd be hilarious. This is probably one of the best books you can ever read on socialism. Whether you're left or right winger, like if you hate it or love it, like this will teach you about what it really is, and it's hilarious because this book is literally mansplaining Marxism. Like it's a man telling an intelligent woman, she's intelligent because she listens to me, So there's a lot to be said about the irony of this title. But again, the book's very important, and he'll tell you things like what is, some of the earliest forms of socialism. Well, the lighthouse, right, or the Roman road, because without a road, you can't have trade. Without the lighthouse, ships crash. How long can the rich avoid getting the plague? Until the poor get the plague. The rich can avoid the plague until the poor get it. Once the poor get it, then everybody gets the plague, right? How do you avoid your rich kids falling in potholes? Well, you have to patch all the poor streets that have potholes, because when they're playing in the streets, they're going to fall in. So there's a ubiquitousness of these ideas of social control, the opposite of laissez-faire, because laissez-faire is saying, oh, it'll work out on its own, and it just hasn't been. So socialism, capitalism, Sovietism, and fascism, all these ideas, really, it tends to be a distraction from his main goal, which is to explain socialism and capitalism as a unifying force, that capitalism requires a certain amount of socialism to work, and that humanity requires a certain amount of socialism in order to stay alive. I don't know if it's true or false. I kind of have a lot of problems with George Bernard Shaw, if you couldn't tell when I called him a psychopath. By the way, he is stuffed, and you can stand up and see him covered in mercury like a cockroach in a museum anytime you want, and how's that for utilitarianism? But weird guy. So anyway, she was fascinated. Mary Pinchot was fascinated with George Bernard Shaw, and in college, Cord Meyer was as well, and this led to Joseph McCarthyism, accusing the wrong people in a lot of ways. And he was kind of right in the sense that he was starting to realize that there was a bigger thing going on with authoritarian economics, but he just didn't really understand it. And he thought that it was like these guys wanted to work with the Russians, and you can really tell that from American television. So Joseph McCarthy did a lot of good for the communists by bringing so much attention to the wrong people that it was easy for them to get away, the right people to get away. While there's a witch trial going on, the right people snuck out quietly, and the wrong people who just did the part, like, hey, this guy, Zero Mostel, right? And again, with my Psy episode, but Zero Mostel, you can see, this guy was like, they're like, of all the people that need to be arrested, this Jewish comedian from Fiddler on the Roof, we have to take him out, and so he came in and he was just hilarious, black years, and they said, are you aware that there's a communist in the room? And he's like, where is he? Get him, and like at the court case, like, he was hilarious. So the point is, they brought in all these people that the CIA had basically hired anyway, and so the CIA was able to convince America that A, hating on communism wasn't working, and B, maybe some of these guys were good because they're funny. And so this led to the 60s in a lot of ways. And Cord Meyer destroyed the idea of anti-communism in the 60s. It goes away, essentially. And more people become pro-communistic, and you start to see intellectuals that are competing with Bill Buckley. You know, you have God, what's his name? Noam Chomsky, and all of these other psychopaths, right? These other sociopathic psychopaths, and they come out and they start to be pushed by the Cord Meyer efforts to remove the CIA's long-standing issues with communism, because communism has looked bad for America for a while. And then the Democrats start pushing harder and harder, and this is where you see the transition between the Republicans and the Democrats in terms of being more socialist or laissez-faire. The Democrats go from being, I mean, not really, they're still the racist party, but they go from being like the KKK party to being the, you know, Kennedy prohibition mafia party, right? I don't know how else to put it. They start as a mafia party, and then they start to bring in people like Kennedy, and Kennedy looks good because he says, yeah, you know, my family were rich, but I'm so rich you can't buy me off. Sound familiar? So that was the Trumpian Kennedy experience for so many people. And yeah, they made sure this happened. And then Cord Meyer, you know, his own wife runs off with the dude he's been trying to get elected so he can make sure that liberation theology and communism can work out in America. And so there's a bit of irony there. And I thought that was funny. So relationship with Kennedy after the divorce. Pinche Myers and her two surviving sons moved to Georgetown. She began painting again and converting garage studio at the home of her sister Toni and Toni's husband, Ben Bradley. She began a close relationship with abstract minimalist painter Kenneth Noland and became friendly with Robert F. Kennedy, who had purchased his brother's house, Hickory Hill, in 1957. Nina Burley, in her book A Very Private Woman, writes that after the divorce, Pinche Meyer became a well-bred ingenue, out looking for fun and getting in trouble along the way. Counterintelligence official James Angleton told Joan Bross, the wife of John Bross, Joan and John, a high-ranking CIA official, that he had began tapping Pinche Meyer's telephone after she left her husband. Angleton often visited her Georgetown home and took her sons on fishing outings. Pinche Myers visited John F. Kennedy at the White House in October 1961, and the relationship became sexually intimate. It's amazing. Even Wikipedia has to pretend this took a couple of years extra. Pinche Myers told Anne that James Truitt was keeping a diary. Okay, so, but of course, you know, but she was really, this is pathological that this guy has to pretend that everything was fine up until it wasn't, you know, and then when she really said that it has to end now. More than 10 years after Pinche Meyer's death, rumors of her affairs with the Kennedy began to circulate. In 1976, they were confirmed by the National Enquirer, then the Washington Post. 19 years later, Post editor Ben Bradley went into great detail about his sister-in-law, Pinche Meyer's life, and the murder in his autobiography, A Good Life. I don't remember if it's Ben Bradley that I'm going to be showing you some footage from. I think it's a little later. Well, smoking marijuana in the White House bedroom, in the 2-year affair. Yeah, I mean, if you really want to get into it, it's pretty fascinating. Anyway, I think I'm going to show you a clip now from the documentary interview with the CIA about Cord Meyer and general fast times at Ridgemont High, you know, kind of thing. Feel free to, if you have any questions or something, you can continue to send them during the chat. See you in a minute.
This week on Book Notes, our guest is Evan Thomas, Assistant Managing Editor and Washington Bureau Chief at Newsweek magazine. He joins us to discuss his recent book, The Very Best Men, Four Who Dared the Early Years of the CIA.
Evan Thomas, why the title, The Very Best Men?
Well, it's slightly ironic. They were the very best men in the sense that they were bright, bold, brave men who did the very best they could to conquer communism for the CIA in the early 1950s, but things didn't turn out as well as they'd hoped, and it's a bit of a play on the best and the brightest. A lot of what they tried to do didn't turn out so well. But they were the very best in the sense that they were the smartest around and the boldest around and the most daring.
Who were they?
They were a group of 4 senior officials at the CIA who ran what's called the clandestine service, the part of the CIA that carries out covert action, espionage, the sexy part of the CIA, if you will. They were the covert action specialists. Richard Bissell, who was the most famous probably of the group who ran the Bay of Pigs, or ran the CIA into the Bay of Pigs. Frank Wisner, who began it all in the late 40s. Tracy Barnes, who was never ran it, but was an assistant for all the big operations like Guatemala and the Bay of Pigs. And Desmond Fitzgerald, who ran the covert action part of the agency in the mid-60s and was a sort of swashbuckling, glamorous figure.
Where'd you get the idea for the book?
I got it from writing The Wise Men, which was a book that came out about 10 years ago about the old foreign policy establishment. And one of the social friends of two of the Wise Men were Chip Bolin and George Kennan. They were senior foreign policy makers after the war, and one of their friends was Frank Wisner. Frank Wisner killed himself in 1965, and I thought, boy, there's got to be a story in there. The man who started the CIA's clandestine service, who started the Department of Dirty Tricks, as reporters later called it, shot himself. I thought, why? What happened? And I started pulling on that string, and it led me to these 4 characters.
Why did Frank Wisner kill himself?
He was manic. The short answer is that he was manic depressive. The more interesting and longer answer is that he tried to do too much. He tried to create this fantastic covert operation capability to fight the Soviet Union in the 1950s. We were up against a very tough foe, the KGB, and he had at best limited success, and he had some tragic setbacks, particularly the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, and it got to him. He went mad on the job.
Where?
At the Central Intelligence Agency, in his office down on the Washington Mall, and the Tempos, they called them. They were an old temporary headquarters down on the mall, and he literally went nuts. He had to be escorted from the building and taken to a mental institution in Baltimore.
So what kind of a story was it then?
Well, the story was a tragedy.
I mean, was it a front page story that he killed himself? Was it that big a deal?
He killed himself later. It wasn't, the press didn't cover the CIA in 1950. When he had his breakdown in 1958, nobody knew. Today, if the head of the clandestine service, if the head of the department, the Directorate of Operations, was escorted from the building by men in white jackets, it would be all over the New York Times and C-SPAN and everywhere else. In 1958, the press just wasn't paying attention, or they felt it was unpatriotic to pay attention to what the CIA was doing. And all of this happened without a murmur. He finally shot himself in 1965, and that got respectful editorials in the Post and the Times, but no news play.
What was the Georgetown Sunday night supper club?
It was an odd institution. Right after the war in Georgetown, all the smart set lived. All the really kind of glamorous people who had gone to places like Harvard and Yale and worked for the kind of most exciting agencies. And the CIA was the most exciting place to work. And every Sunday night was maids' night out. All these people were well-to-do, and their maids would go out and they would get together and have a potluck supper, at which they would drink a great deal. It's hard today to imagine how much people drank in those days. Coming out of World War II, they were so glad to be alive. Prohibition was over. They all drank like fishes, and they had these raucous evenings till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And the people at them included Joe Alsop, famous, very powerful columnist at the time, Chip Bolin, who was helped making our foreign policy, George Kennan, who was famous to many people as a kind of creator of American foreign policy after the war, and many of these CIA hands, including Wisner and Barnes. And they had these sort of kind of a raucous, almost fraternity-like at times, good time. They would fight and argue and have a great time.
For someone who's never been to Washington, can you describe Georgetown?
Well, it's different. For a long time, it was where the sort of attractive Democratic preppies hung out. It's a little bit a contradiction in terms. In Washington, the sort of cool crowd in the 1950s were liberal Democrats, Stevensonian Democrats. They didn't like Eisenhower. They sort of put down Eisenhower as being dull, Midwestern, wore bad suits, didn't know the right wines. And the people who were sort of sharper and cooler tended to be liberal. They tended to be, but they were liberal interventionists. It was the kind of liberalism that doesn't really exist anymore. They wanted to save the world by conquering the world. They wanted a very active CIA and a very active State Department. They wanted America to be a great power to take its rightful role running the world. And these people were by and large headquartered in Georgetown. There's still remnants left. Mrs. Graham, who runs the Washington Post, still has dinner parties in Georgetown where she has policymakers and they eat good food and in a kind of glamorous setting, and it's all, everybody's vaguely self-satisfied. And, you know, they're fun to go to, but they're a vestige of something that was once a very powerful institution. You cannot understand the CIA. In fact, you can't understand the government of the United States, at least the foreign policy part of it, unless you understand what Georgetown was like in the late 40s and early 50s. All friends, they all knew each other, they had gone to school together, they'd been in the same clubs together, they were godfathers to each other's children, they drank together at the Sunday night supper. They were a world unto themselves, and they made policy.
On this program recently, we had Ben Bradley, and I want to make a connection here because in that book, we talked about Mary Meyer, right. And you in your book talk about Cord Meyer.
Right.
You also talk about the towpath along the canal on Sundays where everybody went down there. What's the connection between Mary Meyer and Cord Meyer and the towpath?
Right. Well, it's all stuff for conspiracy theorists. Cord Meyer was this glamorous figure from St. Paul's and Yale who was in the CIA. He ran a division of the CIA. And his wife, Mary, was having an affair with the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. And when she died, Ben Bradley, who was married to Mary Meyer's sister, went looking for Mary Meyer's diary, was asked to find and destroy this diary. He found the diary, and it was a diary of her affair with the president. Well, at the very same time, when Bradley's looking for Mary Meyer's diary, James Jesus Angleton of the CIA is out there looking for the same diary. In fact, breaking into a barn, I believe it was, or a garage. This is all recounted in Bradley's book. Very creepily, Mary Meyer died, was murdered on the towpath. The conspiratorial significance of the towpath is that's where all the CIA guys used to go for Sunday walks with their kids and their dogs. After lunch on Sunday, they would go down to the towpath and go for these long walks and talk to each other. So it's all kind of oddly spooky connected dots. I'm not sure it really means anything, but...
Is Cord Meyer still alive?
Yeah, he's still alive.
Did you talk to him for this book?
Yes, I did. He's a very interesting figure. He's a sad story in some ways, a very glamorous figure who was the beau ideal of his generation. He was going to save the world. A Marine, a hero, lost an eye on Taro, I think it was, or one of the islands in the South Pacific. Extremely idealistic. Came into the CIA as a matter of idealism. Became seriously anti-communist. And his friends say somewhat warped and bent by it. Became a sad figure over time, a sort of cynical figure, a doubter, somewhat wary. His friends, this is a little harsh, but his friends say he spent a life too long in secrets. He got taken over by that strange world of the CIA and bent in some way. He lost his basic idealism and sense of hope.
You say in the beginning that you interviewed 66 CIA agents. Current CIA agents or former?
Agents is a misnomer. Case officers and officials. An agent is somebody that the CIA hires to do their spying, usually a foreign national. These are all case officers or officials. The interesting thing about it was how free they were in talking to me. You would think the CIA would be clammed up. I mean, they're keeping secrets, but the Cold War's over. A lot of these men are older and facing their maker and thought, well, now's the time to tell my story. And also their personalities tended to be larger than life and lively. There's such a distinctive contrast to me with bureaucrats I see today in my day job working for Newsweek who tend to be pretty cautious by and large. This group was not cautious. They were very bold. And they were bold in their actions as CIA officials in the 1950s. And by the time I got to them, they were pretty bold in talking to me. Only, I think, maybe 5 of them refused to talk at all. There are no unattributed. There's only one unattributed quote in the entire book. Everything else is on the record.
And I wanted to ask you about that because I went back and found it where it's number 12 in chapter 21, and the unattributed quote is confidential interview. Why was that? Why one out of the whole bunch?
This person was talking to me about the CIA's assassination plots in the early 60s, and he didn't want it known that he knew of those plots at that time. He was describing a scene in which he's talking with Tracy Barnes about, they're kind of laughing about the attempt of hiring the mafia to kill Castro in the early 60s, and I think he felt he didn't want it generally known that he was witting, as they say, or privy to these plots at that time.
You say that you are the first outsider journalist or historian ever permitted to see the CIA's own secret histories of its operations in the first 2 decades of its existence. How come? Why did they let you do it?
Well, the CIA was sort of fumbling around trying to figure out what to do after the Cold War ended. They're exempt. The Operations Directorate, the clandestine service, is exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. They don't have to tell you anything. But Congress was putting some pressure on them to open up, and so they decided 3 or 4 years ago to use me as a kind of guinea pig and allow me in to see some things. I by no means saw everything. What I saw were their own secret histories. The CIA has a whole history staff, and they write secret histories that nobody can read because they're classified. It's kind of like librarians who love books so much they don't want anybody to read them. But I was allowed to read these histories, which are interesting, but it's important to note they are incomplete, they're turgid, they're written by intelligence officers, not professional historians. They don't promise to be complete records. They are very interesting windows into the way the CIA viewed itself at the time. And I took them as that, and I found some interesting tidbits. No shocking revelations. Interestingly, to me, all the big secrets are out. Only in this country would we really know all the big secrets of our intelligence service. In fact, we probably know more about the CIA than we do about the history of the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Housing and Urban Development, because their scandals forced out their big secrets, chiefly in the 1970s during the Church Committee hearings.
You say that you signed an agreement.
I signed a secrecy agreement. It was a complicated process. I was afraid that if they wanted me to sign an all-purpose secrecy agreement that would allow them to censor my book. I refused to do that. I hired a lawyer, Sven Holmes, who's now a federal judge in Oklahoma, who had been the chief counsel of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He represented me for over 2 years in long negotiations, and we worked out a deal that worked this way. I wrote an entire book without any access at all. I submitted that book. This is based on my interview. I wrote a book based largely on sources that already exist and my interviews with old spooks. I submitted that manuscript and I said, you tell me what bothers you in this manuscript. What are you going to want to take out? What don't you like? They gave me a list of about 50 items, and then we went through each one, and I found basically public sourcing or convinced them that these items were in no way a harm to the national security, and all but I think about 2 cases. Once we had settled that, we took that manuscript aside, and they made an agreement not to touch that, to ask for no further changes in that, but just to accept what I had written. Then I was allowed in. I read their histories. I took notes. I submitted my notes to them, and they looked at that, and they decided what, from my notes, they were going to let me print. They let me have just about everything. The thing that they're still sensitive about are some code names, for reasons I'm not entirely clear about. They're sensitive about code names. The identities of agents, they don't like to print that for obvious reasons. If I had read the record of them bribing a foreign official, they weren't about to allow me to print that. But generally, they were pretty open. They allowed me to use specific details about covert operations all the way back. They withheld virtually nothing.
How many wives of some of your principals did you talk to that are still living?
All that are still living, which is to say 3 of the 4. Mrs. Fitzgerald was dead. Polly Fritchie did not tell me much. She was basically against the book, didn't want me writing about her
Who
husband.
was Polly Fritchie?
Polly Wisner, Frank Wisner's widow, was against the book, still doesn't like it, wishes that I had never written it. It's personal. It's her husband who was just killed himself, and she didn't want me to write about it.
Did she then marry Clayton Fritchie?
Yeah, she's married to Clayton Fritchie.
Still alive?
Still alive.
Former
Clayton Fritchie was, among other things, an aide to Adlai Stevenson in the early 60s, a former newspaperman, well-known around town. And he married Polly after Frank died, after Frank killed himself in 1965. Some years later, Polly married Clayton. So she didn't talk to me. Mrs. John Lawrence, Tracy Barnes's widow, talked to me, and so did Mrs. Bissell.
I should know this, I don't, but is Frances Fitzgerald the writer?
She's the writer. She's the daughter of Desmond Fitzgerald. Interesting connection. I mean, Frankie Fitzgerald is a really great writer, won a Pulitzer Prize for the book Fire in the Lake in 1973 or so. And
About Vietnam?
About Vietnam. Her father was running the clandestine service of the CIA, heavily engaged in Vietnam, while she was over researching that book in 1967.
There's a scene in here at the Sunday night supper club at Joe Alsop's where she's at the table, as I remember.
It's an offshoot of the Sunday night supper, which was not really a club. It was just known as the Sunday night supper. There's a great scene in which Alsop, Joe Alsop, was a great Cold Warrior, is heartened by the idea of young men, the next generation coming along to fight the next good fight in Vietnam, including Frank Wisner Jr., Frank Wisner's son, and other sort of Harvard, Princeton, Yale types who were in the Foreign Service. Richard Holbrooke, who's a pretty important player today. That generation was coming along, and Alsop was, go get them. And these guys, the younger generation, looked at Alsop and said, are you crazy? This war is a disaster. You're out of your mind. And a huge fight, generational fight, ensued. And Frankie's father, Desmond Fitzgerald, who was then running the covert action part of the CIA, looked at the young generation and said, oh, you're all so wet. He used a British upper class put down of the younger generation for being wet, means kind of wimpy, soft, weak.
There's another reference to wet affairs.
Wet affairs are KGB, assassination, blackmail. It's the dirty end of covert action. The 13th directorate of the KGB carries out wet affairs.
Where did you grow up? What town?
I grew up in Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island, a town that was full of people very much like the characters I wrote about.
Where'd you go to school?
I went to Andover to boarding school, I went to Harvard College, and then to the University of Virginia Law School.
And your father was in what?
He was a book publisher, published people, not this crowd, but published Chip Bolin. He published books, typically memoirs of statesmen, public affairs books in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s.
What was it like growing up in that home?
Well, I got a dose of what then passed for the American upper class. This town was full of people who had gone to Yale and ran Wall Street.
Your hometown? My
hometown. It was a commuter town outside of New York, very self-consciously WASP, and the kind of town that you read about in Cheever short stories. I don't know if it's that way today, but it was in the 1950s and 60s when I was growing up.
What role did your grandfather's public life play in your life?
It's a little complicated because my grandfather was a socialist. And this is one of these sort of only in America stories. Although my grandfather was a socialist and against private capital and private wealth, or wanted to redistribute
Norman Thomas.
Norman Thomas. He married a wealthy woman, and Norman Thomas, the great socialist, basically lived off clipping coupons, dividend checks from U.S. trust companies. He lived off of capitalism. So I grew up in a highly capitalistic world, even though my grandfather was a socialist. It was a kind of it seems contradictory. It's sort of like, I guess the analogy is the Fabians in 19th century England. You could live upper class, but still preach socialism. And there was a vestige of this in this town, this kind of liberal idealism that these upper class WASPs had. A beau example would be John Lindsay in New York in the 1960s.
Did I read that your grandfather ran 6 times for president?
Right, he did.
6? What was the first year, do you remember?
24 through 48.
He followed Eugene Debs.
Yeah, he was the sort of figurehead and spokesman for the Socialist Party from 24 to 48.
What was he like?
Wonderful guy. He was full of stories, and he was a better grandfather than a father. I think my father was utterly neglected by him because he was always off trying to save the world. So my father never saw him or saw very little of him. By the time I came along as his grandson, he had all the time in the world to tell stories. And I got from the combination of growing up around my grandfather, who had a social conscience and saw the world in a wider way, and growing up in this preppy little town had an influence on me. I was sort of getting it from both sides.
What kind of an influence?
I think it's one of the reasons why I write books like this. I'm interested in the sociology, this sounds pompous, the sociology of the American upper class, such as it existed. I have a somewhat critical take on it. They did some great things, Marshall Plan, Western Alliance, but they also did some stupid things, and I document them in this book, The Bay of Pigs and various CIA excesses, hiring the mafia. What a crazy idea. Why the CIA thought they could hire the mafia to kill Castro still almost escapes me, although I tried to write about it in this book. And I think that my background growing up in the 60s, going to Harvard at a time that it was pretty liberal, I had a liberal sensibility, but I came from a conservative background, and the combination gave me a sense of curiosity, a sort of a skeptical curiosity and fascination with the workings of the American aristocracy.
Going back to your grandfather again, I read somewhere that he was an anti-communist.
He was a fierce anti-communist. In the lefty battles of the 1930s, there were the socialists early on saw that the communists were bad guys. They were dictatorial and totalitarian, and my grandfather was very much a democratic socialist. He didn't want Stalin dictating to him, and he was early on warned the left, don't fall for the communists, don't fall into that trap. I'm being crude here, but they're bad guys, and they're going to lead you astray.
I wrote down a whole bunch of names, and I don't know that we can do this, but if we go through maybe some of them fast to tell us who they are. Some of them have connections with today. You keep quoting in this book Tom Braden.
Tom Braden, who's known to many people as a TV and radio commentator, early on ran propaganda at the CIA and international organizations. He was one of these, he came out of Dartmouth, went to World War II, and the idealistic thing to do was join the CIA. So he did, and worked there for about 4 years.
E. Howard Hunt.
E. Howard Hunt's famous for Watergate, for breaking into the Watergate. He was an early CIA operative. In the jargon of the time, he thought black. He always saw things in a kind of deceptive, deceiving, or he always thought that the CIA was being deceived, and he always wanted to figure out how to trump them by doing something duplicitous. And he was a clever covert action operator, obviously not clever enough because they got caught breaking into the Democratic Party headquarters in 1972. But early on, he was a clever CIA operative.
Did you talk to him for this book?
Yes.
What's he doing now?
I read that he's in bankruptcy. I think he's having a hard financial time. I don't really know what he's doing. He's obviously retired. He's an interesting character, kind of a strange American character. He wrote 60 novels, I think 60 novels, often spy novels, mystery novels. He's kind of a delightful character who was going to always be a footnote in American history because they got caught in Democratic Party headquarters on June 1972 he got caught.
What is Tom Braden doing now?
Braden is retired. I think he still does some journalism, but not as much. He used to be a pretty regular radio commentator. I don't think he does as much now.
You also had a name that I think it's his son that ran for vice president, but Endicott Peabody.
Yeah. Endicott Peabody was the famous rector of Groton. He was kind of the Wasp.
Let me stop you about Groton. Where is Groton?
Groton School is a little tiny school that most people have never heard of, northwest of Boston. That was a kind of ruling class preserve, the Morgans and the Vanderbilts and sort of the American ruling class of the late 19th century and the Harrimans, early 20th century, sent their sons there to be educated and also to get a sense of public service. Endicott Peabody preached public service. And one reason why so many of these chaps went into the CIA or the State Department was what they learned in chapel at Groton School.
And Frank Wisner, Des Fitzgerald, Tracy Barnes, Richard Bissell, did they all go to Groton? 2 of them went to Groton.
Fitzgerald went to St. Mark's, which is the sort of sister school of Groton, and Wisner was a Southerner, a Mississippi boy who came out of slightly a variation on the American aristocracy, the kind of Mississippi version. His family literally built a little town in Mississippi, owned lumber mills down there, and they built the parks, the library, the school. They owned the place, and young Wisner grew up as almost a kind of feudal lord.
You say you went to Andover. Where's that?
Andover is a boarding school, not unlike Groton. It's a little bigger and a little bit less upper crusty, north of Boston, about 30 miles north of Boston.
Who are some of the alums that we might know?
George Bush is the most famous one, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Henry Stimson, Humphrey Bogart.
What's it like being at Andover compared to the regular public school? What's the difference?
There's a difference. The quality of education is good. I mean, this teaching is rigorous, but it is a world unto itself. When you go to a boys' boarding school, it is insular, and this is not true today so much, they're co-ed and they're freer, but for many years, for a couple of centuries at Andover, they were isolated, insulated world where they have their own ethos, their own ethic, their own way of living and looking at the world, and it's profoundly affecting to its graduates.
Other names, Donald Gregg is in your book.
Donald Gregg was George Bush's national security advisor and ambassador to Korea, I believe, and an old CIA hand who was our man in Korea for many years. Goes way back as a Far East hand.
Did you talk to him?
Yes, I did.
What's he doing now?
I think he's running a Korea Friendship Society up in New York. I don't think he has any CIA contacts. It's just he's an old Korea hand.
Another name from the past that popped up in your book is the Reverend William Sloane Coffin.
He, believe it or not, William Sloane Coffin, famous to all of us as a great anti-war protester, started in the CIA. He was running agents behind the Iron Curtain in the late 1940s.
Where is he now?
I think he's living up in Vermont. I think he's retired, although he probably still preaches. I think he's still probably has a social conscience and still trying to do good. But my memory is I talked to him over the phone in Vermont.
Where did you go that you had to go to the greatest lengths to get to in order to get this book written?
Most of these old spooks live within 20 miles of the studio, so it wasn't that tough. I did go to Paris to talk to Frank Wisner's old mistress, Princess Karaja, this Romanian princess that he took up with in World War II, kind of romantic figure. I met her up in her garret in Paris. I guess that's about as exotic as I got.
What's she all about today?
She's sitting there with her love letters, older woman, you know, kind of a old grande dame who met Frank. A very romantic story. Wisner was the OSS man. The OSS was the Office of Strategic Services, America's spy agency in World War II. And Wisner was sent to Bucharest, to Romania, to Budapest, in 1944, and he early on saw that the Russians were coming. And that was an important moment because everybody else was paying attention to the Germans. We were still fighting Germany. And Frank Wisner said, next foe is going to be the Russians because the Russians were trying to take over Romania. And while he was there, he began a love affair with this Princess Karaja. Like a lot of wartime love affairs, it ended. But Joe McCarthy, the right-wing demagogue, and the FBI tried to use it against Wisner in the 1950s when they were out to get the CIA and bureaucratic warfare. The FBI basically tried to blackmail the CIA by saying to Frank Wisner and to Allen Dulles, who was running the CIA, remember Princess Karaja? We have information about her. She's a communist spy. I don't think that was true, but they claimed it. You better come up here and answer questions about it. All an intimidation attempt by the McCarthyites to get the CIA. To the CIA's credit, they stood up to it and refused to be blackmailed.
How old is the princess today?
I'm guessing 70-something. She's an older lady.
And when he had her as a mistress, what year was it?
1945, winter of 1945.
Was he married then?
Yes.
Was he married to Polly?
Yes, he was.
Did she know about the mistress?
Yeah, she knows about it now. I don't think she knew about it at the time.
Speaking of mistresses, you also tell us in the book that Allen Dulles had lots of mistresses.
He was famous for it.
Was he famous then, and was it public then?
Nothing was public then. Nothing was public about the CIA. The press was completely in the dark.
Did you make it public for the first time? Allen Dulles?
Dulles has been written about. Dulles is, the joke was that every time he got that his wife knew that he'd gotten a new lover because he'd go to Cartier and buy his wife a new diamond. That meant that Allen Dulles had just gotten a new mistress.
Who was he?
Allen Dulles was the kind of they used to call him the Great White Case Officer. He ran the CIA in the 50s during this high age when they were swashbuckling, and And he loved covert action and encouraged the kind of shenanigans that I write about in my book.
And his brother?
His brother was John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State. It made foreign policy a lot easier in the 1950s because when you had the head of the CIA and the head of the State Department as brothers, one could just pick up the phone, call the other, and get the job done.
Let me name a couple of countries you write about and give us some background on it. You spend a little time on Albania.
Yeah.
Why? Where is Albania?
Albania is a little pocket of the world off of the Aegean Sea. It's north of Greece and south of Yugoslavia. And it was the CIA's first target for what they call rollback. The hope right after World War II, after the Iron Curtain fell, was to roll back the Iron Curtain. And the first target, the CIA's first target, was the country of Albania, which they thought they could stage a revolution in. Frank Wisner, parachuted a lot of agents in there, hoping to foment a revolution. It was a fiasco. All the agents were killed, or more typically doubled. They were turned into communist agents and played back the other way. It's a standard communist trick, is to capture a spy, double him, and make him work against the side that he had come from. And this was the first operation. This is about 1949, 50, 51.
In your book, what's new for somebody that follows this whole story?
There are tidbits. What's new? What I wanted to do was bring stick figures to life. It's really a social history as much as anything else. It's to make you understand that all the spooky stuff that the CIA was doing had a human dimension, and the human dimension was this insular, clubby group that lived in Georgetown, that went to places like Groton, that had a certain mindset, a certain ethic, and to try to explain that and to understand that. There are a few new operational details. Richard Bissell told me about an assassination plot against Sukarno of Indonesia. This is a little crude, but the CIA was going to give Sukarno a case of venereal disease by somehow through Sukarno was a sex fiend who liked airline stewardesses.
He's still around.
It's not Sukarno.
I'm thinking of Suharto. I'm sorry. Yeah, right.
Sukarno was a well-known lover of sex who bragged about it, and he specialized in Pan Am stewardesses. And the CIA was going to somehow give a Pan Am stewardess a case of potentially lethal VD. This all sounds wacky. This is a plot that was never carried out. Bissell did tell me about it, and one of his assistants confirmed it. It was interesting, Bissell, when he told me about this nutty plot, Bissell is a very articulate man, speaks in whole paragraphs, or was, he died a year ago, speaks in whole paragraphs. He was famous as a briefer, but when he talked about assassination plots, he became very orotund, and he became, in his words, circumlocutious. He described this plot to assassinate Sukarno by giving him a case of VD as an attempt to biologically immobilize Sukarno through the use of a female associate. That was typical of him when he began talking in this area. He referred to it, he wouldn't use the word assassination, he would say executive action or this method of international rivalry. And his kind of ornateness and his indirection told me that he really was still uncomfortable about it. He really wasn't proud of his involvement in these plots, that even though he expressed no moral regrets, specifically said to me, I have no moral regrets. I have chagrin that they failed, but no moral regrets that we tried them. I don't really believe that. I think he was troubled by it, and one tip-off or one clue was the way he spoke so circumlocutiously.
Where did you find him?
He was had a little office above a shopping center in Hartford, Connecticut. He sat up there with his Greek histories. He loved Greek. He was a great, he's hard to describe. He believed in empire. He grew up as a wealthy boy. He went to Groton. He studied empire. He studied Greek and British empire, and he believed that America's empire had come after World War II. And he was the man to lead the Secret Service of the American empire. And in his old age, he would sit up there reading the history of the Peloponnesian Wars and Homer and Greek history and relive this empire that he wasn't able quite to replicate for the United States in the Cold War.
How many days did you spend with him?
I spent about 4 days. He could talk all day long, even though he was then 80 years old. He drank a lot. We would sit there drinking wine, and by the end of the day, I'd be looped. and he seemed completely sober and always lucid.
What years did you talk to him, or what year?
I saw him in '92 and '93, and then I would talk to him on the phone in '94. I would call him up with follow-up questions. He was like all these men, a complete gentleman. You know, it's curious. Here's what people, it was Bissell's idea to hire the mafia, one of the truly crazy ideas in American government, to have the CIA hire the mafia.
What year?
1960, September 1960.
How'd he do it?
He got his chief of security to approach a cutout to go to Johnny Rosselli, a mid-level mobster in Las Vegas, who then went to Sam Momo Giancana to deliver poisons to Castro.
Sam Giancana, the same man who had Judith Exner as a girlfriend?
Right. The plot thickens here because the suspicion has always been that Judith Exner, was somehow a liaison between then President Kennedy and Sam Giancana in their plots to either kill Castro or buy the vote in Cook County in the '60.
Judith Exner's still alive?
Yes, she is.
How about Sam Giancana?
Dead. Killed in a mob hit while he was cooking Italian sausages in his basement in right before he was set to testify before the Church Committee looking into CIA plots.
Who was Church?
Senator Church.
Frank Church.
Frank Church, excuse me, was a Democratic senator who, right after Watergate, conducted a series of hearings looking into CIA abuses. After Watergate, it was like we picked up a giant rock, the rock of government. We wanted to see everything scurrying around underneath. And one of the things they looked at was the CIA. And out of those hearings came sort of amazing stories about plots to make Castro's beard fall out, or to assassinate Trujillo or Lumumba, various heads of state. What they called, in the CIA, these were known as the family jewels, illegal acts undertaken over the years by the CIA in the service of their country.
Did you talk to Judith Exner?
No, I didn't.
And back to the Bissell story about the mafia, how far did this go?
Oh, it went pretty far. I mean, they hired the mafia, and the relationship went on for 3 or 4 years. I've always suspected, though, and others, it's not my suspicion, it's particularly a suspicion of the people who worked in the Justice Department at the time, that this was all a scam by the mafia. And it goes to an important issue about my men. They were urbane and sophisticated, but they were naive in a fundamental sense. They thought that you could hire the mafia to kill Castro. I think the mafia took him for the ride. I think the mafia agreed to do this, to pick up a marker against the United States government. So if the Justice Department turned around and tried to prosecute Sam Giancana or Johnny Rosselli, the mobsters could say, hey, we work for you. We're working for Uncle Sam. And in fact, that's exactly what happened.
How much did they get paid?
Nothing. We offered them, I don't remember, $50,000 or $100,000. They wouldn't take the money because they said it was their, quote, patriotic duty, which further enhances my feeling that this was all a scam.
Now, the 4 men that you write about, Frank Wisner, Des Fitzgerald, Tracy Barnes, and Richard Bissell, 3 of them died by the time before they were 61 years old.
Yeah.
And so the only one you talked to is Richard Bissell.
Right.
Paint a little picture of Frank Wisner.
Frank Wisner was, well, the key to him is that he was manic in the best and worst senses. He had enormous energy. He flew. He was high. He used to call the CIA his mighty Wurlitzer. He could play any tune on it. He could plant newspaper stories or hire spies or stage coups or bribe foreign officials to spread the influence of the United States around the world. It was a wonderful kind of ideal, but it was an illusion. It wasn't, he couldn't really do these things, and a lot of them backfired. And when the crash came, when the downer from his mania came, it really came and eventually killed him.
Who painted the best picture for you?
Of Wisner?
Uh-huh.
Oh, social friends probably in Georgetown, his old social chums. Also the spooks, but the people who knew him best were his social buddies.
Did you talk to Joe Alsop before he died?
Not about this book. I interviewed him for The Wise Men, but he died before I really got going on this.
I noticed you credited Bob Mary for giving you material on Joe Alsop, who's going to, and Ed Yoder wrote a book on Joe Alsop. What's the fascination with him?
He was the center of the universe. His dinner parties were the most important dining table in Georgetown, and hence Washington, and hence the world. It was Joe Alsop's in the 1950s. Jack Kennedy, when he was president, would come for dinner there and hold forth, and it was a kind of forum. Alsop was a brilliant, loyal, belligerent, slightly sad homosexual who was an imperious figure, and he would say, well, he'd say to Kennedy, now, why aren't we doing enough about the communists? And Kennedy, sitting at his table, would try to answer him in quite specific detail. In those days, public officials trusted journalists, and they would, over dinner, reveal state secrets, trusting those journalists not to print them. Different rules in the 1950s.
Let me ask you about the business of homosexuality and a lot of the people that are talked about and the mistresses and all that. If you live back in those years, 50, 60, did people know all these stories that are now in your book?
Yes and no. It was suspected that Joe was gay, but they didn't know, for instance, that he'd been caught in a honey trap by the KGB in Moscow in 1956. Joe's first trip to Moscow, he stupidly allowed himself to be set up by the KGB. They caught him in a honey trap and tried to blackmail him. To his credit, he refused to be blackmailed. He refused to have anything to do with the CIA, and he said, "Go ahead, do what you will, but I'm my own man." That story was not known until many years later. However, it was generally known that he was homosexual. But in that era, unlike ours, which is so exhibitionist, people had enormous respect for secrecy and privacy, and they just let Joe alone.
You quote Susan Mary Alsop a lot in the book. Is she his ex-wife?
Ex-wife. She married him in the early 60s, was married for a number of years and divorced him. I think not necessarily because he was homosexual. I think it was more of a friendship and an arrangement, but because he was difficult to live with. Joe was a hard guy to live with. He was a wonderful man in many ways, a loyal friend, brilliant, fun, but difficult.
Paint a picture of Desmond Fitzgerald.
He was often compared to a kind of Renaissance cavalier. He was romantic, swashbuckling. He had a sense of whimsy. He would always quote from Alice in Wonderland. When he was planning covert operations, he would quote from Alice in Wonderland, and his aides would have to look up these allusions to figure out what he was talking about. Very romantic figure, smart, but not always shrewd. It was Desmond Fitzgerald's idea to plant an exploding seashell near the beach where Castro went skin diving. Now, why he thought Castro was going to pick up this particular seashell has never been clear. And in fact, this is a plot, like so many of their plots, a plot they never carried out. But he was an overly ambitious, smart, romantic, very charming, somewhat cold spy master.
Did you talk to his daughter?
Yes.
Frances Fitzgerald, and where is she today?
She is writing books in New York. Brilliant woman. She did not like this project at first.
Why?
Because she thought I was being too tough and sort of one-dimensional about her father. I painted a kind of a stick figure in an early draft, which I showed her. I painted a kind of stick figure version of her father that was harsh and kind of wrong. I talked to her a great deal after that, and she fleshed out a lot of the human details and gave me a better sense of him, as did various of his friends.
What did she think of him?
She loved him. She was his daughter, his rather distant daughter. When she was a little girl, her parents' marriage broke up. Desmond Fitzgerald was married to Marietta Tree, famous socialite, longtime mistress of Adlai Stevenson in later years. Marietta then Peabody, the granddaughter of Endicott Peabody, the rector of Groton. It's all a small world. It's all
father of Endicott Peabody Jr., who ran for vice president.
All one tiny world. They got married before the war. Desmond went off to war. When he came back, Marietta was having an affair with John Huston, the movie director. That was the end of that marriage. So daughter Frankie, lost her father at a young age and didn't see as much of him as she would have liked. Loved him very much, was close to him from afar, had a kind of romantic view of him. He was cold, but he was quite tender with her.
Tracy Barnes.
Very swashbuckling figure, great athlete at Groton and Yale. Grew up on the Whitney estate on Long Island with his own private golf course, so he was par golfer by the time he was about 12 years old. Loved to jump out of airplanes, OSS hero in World War II, jumped behind enemy lines. Won a Silver Star by capturing a German garrison along with one other Frenchman. He went running around firing his carbine in the air, scaring the Germans into thinking they were surrounded, and they surrendered to just these two men. Barnes won a Silver Star for that. Later became a very senior official in the CIA and played an important role in the Guatemala coup and in the Bay of Pigs.
When you look back at these years, how much of that, and you know what's going on today, you're the bureau chief at Newsweek, how much of this is going on today? How many dinner parties they have in Georgetown and CIA people who come out of Yale and Harvard and Princeton?
Much less. There's still a clubby feel to the CIA because it's insular, but it's not WASP. Mostly graduates of state universities. It's much more middle class. There are a lot of Mormons today in the CIA. They like Mormons because they have language skills. They've traveled a lot. They're good proselytizers. It's not Groton and Yale anymore. In fact, I doubt there's a single Groton graduate active in the CIA today. At the time, just to give you a sense of how important Groton School was to the CIA, the first significant coup in Iran was run by Kermit Roosevelt, class of 36, with assistance from Archie Roosevelt, class of 34. The second big coup a year later in Guatemala was planned by Tracy Barnes, class of 32, with assistance from Richard Bissell, class of 31. Bissell and Barnes planned the Bay of Pigs with assistance from John Bross, who was the senior prefect of the class of 32. The poisons that were mixed to kill Castro were mixed in a lab run by Cornelius Roosevelt, class of 34. I mean, Groton played a big role in the CIA in the 1950s.
Graham Greene, the Quiet American, and Edward Lansdale. Explain all that.
Edward Lansdale, known as the Quiet American or the Ugly American in Letter and Burdick's novel by that name, was the real-life figure. Colonel Lansdale went to the Philippines and ran a counterinsurgency against communist guerrillas or leftist guerrillas that became the model for the idea of you have to get their hearts and minds. If you're going to defeat the communists, you have to win their hearts and minds. The expression of Vietnam later became grab them by the nuts and their hearts and minds will follow. But at the time, it was get their hearts and minds through psychological warfare by disinformation, blackmail. Lansdale was a great expert at this, and he had a great success in the Philippines. They beat back the leftist insurgency. He was then sent to Vietnam, where he helped install President Diem. And Graham Greene ran into him in Vietnam in the mid-'60s and wrote a book called The Quiet American.
Who was Graham Greene?
Graham Greene was a great British novelist who had a great sense of American character. And the thing that was interesting about The Quiet American was that Lansdale was a great idealist, kind of a good soul, but naive. He had a kind of naive, well-intentioned arrogance that the United States was going to save the world, that we knew best, that these third world people didn't know best, that we could impose our democracy or our democratic ideals on them and they would gratefully accept them. Of course, this didn't happen. Didn't happen in Vietnam, didn't happen in many places.
There's one scene that I remember General Lansdale used to have, is it Magsaysay? Is that the way you pronounce it? Slept in the same room with him for a while? What was that all about?
In the 50s, the CIA station chief often ran the third world country, that he was the most powerful person in the country was not the head of state, not the American ambassador, it was the CIA station chief, because the CIA station chief had several things. Cash.
Well, I think we're gonna. There we go. I think we're gonna leave it on that note because I'm worried if I go too deep into the next part that I could get in trouble. So we're going to leave it at that, but we're not going to leave the episode at that. We'll continue on from there. I know, but you can find more of that if you want. Let me jump to my Cord Meyer paperwork here again so I can explain just a little bit because I can keep going in a safer way. Cord Meyer then went on to write something you can find in the JSTOR that I think you'll see so the value here that you might have heard just now. And by the way, thank you again for the super chats for those who sent during the video. And I want to just explain, for those of you who are watching that, you're like, oh, that's interesting. So the CIA has changed a bit. Here's what they used to be like. They were WASPs. You guys know what WASP means? It means white Anglo-Saxon psychopath. And so they refer to people from Connecticut this way. I mean, that's very racist, but that is what the CIA referred to in their own talks. And so they said we need to change this. And as time went on, they were looking at people from Maryland, people from Chicago, inner cities, and they have a lot of people in the CIA now that are from all around America. But particularly, their interest is in the Latter-day Saints, because the Latter-day Saints can speak a bunch of languages, and they don't do drugs. So there's a value to them after the acid era of the CIA. They're like, we got to get Mormons, right? And that's where that went. But then we can get into why this all matters so much about Cord Meyer, because then Cord Meyer is the one who's controlling the media campaign after this. And we start to see the examples. We talk about Mockingbird, right? And the Mockingbird, let's just jump to Mockingbird CIA. You can see Tavistock, mind control, MK Ultra, blah, blah, blah. A lot of it, we don't realize, the most important part of that really is the Mockingbird, the part where it's telling you what to think in the media. I mean, whatever drugs you're on, whatever drugs you're not on, whatever Disney movie you're seeing, Mockingbird, that really matters. And there's a bunch of other programs that existed onto the existence of Mockingbird. And this isn't the episode on the Church Committee, and we're going to spend a lot of time on the Church Committee because I want you guys to fully understand it in detail. But what I will say about it is that some of the revelations from MK Ultra and COINTELPRO and everything, Shamrock, right? These things, this is all happening in 1975. What else is going on in 1975? Right? Let me just remind you that Watergate was a scandal that took all of the attention away for years. And so when Church Committee hearing stuff happened, it was just sort of another aspect of Watergate, and it was blamed on Nixon, and very few people paid attention to it. And this is why you don't know as much about the Church Committee hearing, and why everybody who knows nothing about anything has heard of the Watergate scandal, because the Watergate scandal was, in a lot of ways, designed to take away, to distract from the real Church Committee hearings and everything associated with Project Shamrock, right? Which was the telecommunication. If you remember from my episode recently with the hacker Prince, Mike Wilkerson, Project Shamrock is very important because the control of communications and control of all of the information. This is something that recently has been up again. I think, what was that? USPS spying on people. There was a huge thing they have internet companies. USPS spies on American social media posts and have inspector agencies. Now, I mean, the Federal Post is one of the scariest intelligence gathering agencies in the world. Their logo even says so. And like the police, the use of bureaucracy to seem inept is used to make them seem inept, when there's several layers of any agency, and this agency is one of the most important because it controls communications in a lot of ways that people don't realize. So there are plenty of people that on a need-to-know basis that don't know what they're doing in the post office that are decent people. And then there's another reason why dogs don't trust the post office, right? It's kind of a joke because the post office is involved in a lot of these things. Project Shamrock is being continued on through. And you heard also this guy talking about how socialists were anti-Stalinites at the time. A lot of them thought Stalin was wrong. You remember maybe yesterday we were talking about Trotsky and the intelligentsia. Well, the intelligentsia and WASPs have a lot in common. A lot of people in Connecticut that would have qualified as Trotskyite to an extent, anti-Stalinite. And there were more and more people saying, hey, we can modify the capitalist system to be more sustainable, like George Bernard Shaw. And this led to, as he said, Fabianism. Fabian, it was a general in Rome, supposedly, who would not win the war until he'd won all these little battles. But by committing to winning all these battles, eventually he would win the war. So the Plea for World Government paper, which you can get on JSTOR, is a Cord Meyer publication. And it talks a lot about, and you can, this is the thing, Wikipedia is only going to tell you so much, and Brittany has a ton of these books. So hopefully as time goes on, we'll be able to pull up more and more examples of these little snuck-in pieces by Cord Meyer in 1949, right? Before the leading up to the regular 1965 Monarch programming. So, but I'll just read you this page. Excuse me. A Plea for World Government by Meyer Jr. The creation by a peaceful consent in our time of some form of world government is a tremendously difficult undertaking, and success is obviously uncertain. Because of that fact, a good many people feel that those who are practically working today for world government must be utopian idealists. Yet, in spite of some monumental difficulties and in the face of active opposition by official policymakers, the popular movements that are working for world government continue to grow, and at the same time, an increasing number of able and respected men are devoting their energies and time to it. Before all this activity can be dismissed as irrelevant, as escapism from the problems of the real world, it seems to me that the objective observer should take a moment to consider the facts and the logic which force the United World Federalists to the position they take today. A process of elimination and a thorough analysis of the other available courses of action and their consequences have led the Federalists to believe that the only way to preserve peace and the values of civilized life is through the creation of a structure of enforceable world laws above the nations. Okay, so here you start to see anarchy. Maritime anarchy needs to be dismissed by some sort of objective authoritarian power. He doesn't even say what kind. He just says that authoritarianism is the only solution and that laissez-faire is not working. And this is very interesting because this is 1949, and America's whole deal is post-Monrovian period. I mean, now we're talking, of course, about a group of people associated with the Bay of Pigs, group of people that are associated with human slavery, human trafficking, sugar plantations, banana plantations. I mean, when banana republics, you got to understand, like actual state slavery. States made for slaves just so that they could control, and this is not monkeys, right? So it's important to remember who we're talking about here, but they're saying that the law will be eventually created. And another thing to remember is this is Meyer, this is Meyer Jr. with Einstein. Einstein looking kind of MK Ultra, I don't know how to put it. He just looks a little out of it. Maybe he's just thinking about the world, but you've been told, I hope by now, that Einstein wasn't the brilliant genius that he was supposed to be, right? And there was a lot of other people that were actually smart, and most of them were put in insane asylums. So guys like Einstein, who were able to at least popularize Lemaire's theories, right? And I know that Donald will love that I brought this up, and so shout out again to being here, Omega Point Research. But Georges Lemaire, Belgian Catholic priest, theoretical physicist, mathematician, astronomer, and professor of physics at the Catholic University of Louvain. And one of the things he did, aside from writing like the greatest poems ever, which were a cosmogenical creation system of ballads, of poems about the Big Bang and multiverse string theory and God and science and omega string. Oh yeah, dude, you're gonna love Lemaire. Anyway, he said he came up with the Big Bang theory. In fact, here's Einstein ripping off the Big Bang theory now, and basically he had all of this great math that showed MC was equivalent, MC when squared, MC times itself was equivalent to E, or something like that. It was just like literally E equals MC squared, but then sideways. And the other thing was he suggested that the Big Bang had to do with the omega point existing before the alpha state, which was his mathematical explanation of God, which is what Teilhard Chardin was saying as well. All the Jesuits that were coming up with super entity simulation theory stuff we're talking about today is just barely trying to grab onto stuff Lemaire said. Anyway, Einstein just said, well, I could be famous if I steal this guy's theory, but I got to spin it. So what I'll say is there is no God, and it's just it's a random thing. And he tried that for a long time, and it never worked. And eventually he said it was wrong, and he's like, you know what? Actually, Lemaire was right, so we'll go back to Lemaire. But Lemaire's not famous. I mean, unless you're like a Jesuit or you went to school for physics. Lemaire's not famous. So Meyer went with this, he liked to wear heels, and his girlfriend worked in a patent office, and there's a lot of things about Einstein that are important to this building up of kind of the way the Scientologists got celebrities, right? Like the CIA started picking up recruiting celebrities, and Meyer was a big part of that. Anyway, Let me briefly review, therefore, the reasons that we have for rejecting as inadequate the usual courses of action that are advocated for a country in the world. Futility of armament policy. First, there is a present policy of the American government. I will define the policy as an attempt to maintain a preponderance of power so great that no nation will dare to attack us. Thereby, it is hoped that peace will be maintained. In following that policy, we are pursuing a program of domestic rearmament at the cost of $15 billion a year, back when dollars were like real. We are also engaged in a program of economic and military aid. Just kidding, by the way, they were still not real. To our prospective allies in order to ensure strong and loyal allies when the war starts. And we are using an economic boycott in an attempt to weaken the economies of our probable opponents. Finally, we are forming military alliances such as the Atlantic Pact, or in order to gain strategic bases for the eventual war. Now, given the nation-state system in which we live, granted the fact that every nation today is free to prepare for war, in view of the fact there is no assurance in the world that aggression can be effectively dealt with, we in this country have no choice, it seems to me, but to maintain our military defenses. I think more Federalists would agree with that. However, to admit that arms, bases, and allies are necessary today is not to prove that they can ensure either peace or American security in the future. They cannot. They are only temporary, dangerous, stopgap expedients to buy time. And the question is, what are we going to do with the time that we are buying by building up a military force sufficient for a temporary period to stop aggression? The reasons why we can decide conclusively that military rearmament and bases are not enough are well known to most of us. First of all, of course, there is the revolution that has taken place in the nature of war itself, a revolution characterized by new weapons, atomic and biological, and the long-standing, are they going to cut it? Guys, you know what the next part tells you? It tells you that there's a revolution that's taken place in the hearts, bodies, souls, and minds of every man, woman, and child. And this is 1949. So it's before the 60s, before they really go far with this whole movement. And you have to remember, this concludes with Vietnam, which is already going on in 1949, believe it or not. You know, they're looking at France. The CIA is involved with the French Foreign Legion, and we're in Vietnam. So the conclusion of Vietnam into the Nixon period, where the Church Committee, it folds together so nicely. So it's very important that you understand that. I want to talk a little bit more about Frank Snepp, and I'm going to show you guys some stuff about Frank Snepp as well. So Frank Snepp was a CIA officer in Saigon during the Vietnam War. For 5 out of 8 years as a CIA officer, he worked as an interrogator, agent, debriefer, and chief strategy analyst in the United States Embassy of Saigon. He was awarded the Intelligence Medal for Merit, and he also worked for KNBC, but he published a bunch of books, and his first thing was a whistleblower piece that, even though he did not publish anything illegal, because he was working for the CIA before, he'd signed a contract, and so he'd violated his contract with the CIA. And the CIA is separate from the United States, and so he got in trouble, and the CIA made all of the money off of his book. Good for them. But the thing about it is, disinformation is most effective in a very narrow context. I want to also give a little bit of explanation for why, and I mentioned him earlier, Bill Buckley, America's sweetheart and hero, Bill Buckley Sr. is no. That's his father. Bill Buckley Jr. There he is. Handsome, devilishly handsome man with a bit of a Connecticut accent. It sounds a bit sort of Britishized. He would speak like that because he had been raised in British boarding schools, and he was a Atlantic transplant, a winner of the Atlantic, the New English, the New York, the DC scene. You know, everyone thought of him as the cream of the crop and better than them, the best of them. But he was not one of them, right? You know, he's Bill Buckley. And even to the extent of being a Catholic at Yale. Yes, a skull and bones at Yale. How strange, right? Okay, so he went, died in Stanford. Connecticut comes up a lot. He wrote a really cool book series called Blackford Oaks, which I think you can get on Audible if you need something to listen to or something like that. But he talks about the Zeta Psi fraternity, one of the world's oldest collegiate fraternities, the Zeets, and Black Blackie or Black Eye, Blackford Oaks, right? Black Eye connected to the eye club. There's this idea that you get your eye, get a little beat up in the eye right there, right? There's a little thing there, the eye club, right? Secret passages for the group. Little black eye on everybody's face. What happened? Well, either they fall a lot or they're part of the Blackford Oaks Club, the Zeets, and this book series, very interestingly enough, is almost identical to what really happened maybe 20 years before the book series comes out during the life of this Bill Buckley character. And there's a number of books that come out over time that tell you, here's Saving the Queen, 1976, Stained Glass, right? 1976, imagine 1956 or 1952, he goes to England looking for a British double agent. If you think any line of this book is a metaphor and wasn't real, then you're missing the point. Every single one of these books is almost exactly the true history of an agency's mission as best understood by a Skull and Bones agent. So there's a lot to be said about this. And I would say the very pivotal plot of 1994, right? So this is years after the fall of the wall, and it talks about trying to stop the assassination of Gorbachev in order to force the fall of the wall, which is this is maybe less about Gorbachev in real life, and this is just kind of, that might be the actual made up part of this book. But you'll understand, wait, how come he went from telling the complete whole truth to nothing but the truth? So help you God, the space race, 1956, and the uprising of Hungary, right? Like all these things. Che Guevara. And then you've got this point in the 80s where things start to get a little different. Well, why has that happened? Well, that's literally because of SNEP. Let me see if I can find you again. Where did I put him? SNEP went and he pointed out that even though he'd been not allowed as this, he's not quite the WASP of Yale. I forget where he went to. Let me just check that out again. Background: North Carolina, Columbia University, right? Peasant. No, I'm just kidding. But the way they would treat him is different than they would treat someone from Yale, and that's the reason. It's like, you're not part of the club, so he published some things. But the thing was, he was very useful in a certain way because the CIA wanted, and of course Meyer wanted characters like SNEP to go out and to say that they needed to change the agency. And part of the reason was because they were expanding into new agencies and paramilitary intelligence organizations that were created by the CIA or the Catholic Church by Jesuits around the world. You go to another country and you've got a new business somewhere. It's run by somebody who went to a Catholic school and was involved with the Jesuits and went and was involved with the CIA. It is the way it is. In the 80s especially, there's like, well, and this is not even a conspiracy. This is just, how are we going to deal with the world? Well, we can deal with communists as long as we beat the communists militarily and with finances. We'll be allowed to have free market enterprise. And with free market enterprise, well, then we can just go anywhere and we can run the businesses. And that's the beginning of that. And it really comes down to Saigon and in general to the Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos conflicts, because the CIA was aware that some of these fourth world places, which had never been part of Tito's third world plans to avoid World I, which was the United States, World II, which is the Soviet Union, right? Because the Soviets were saying, it's not like class, it's not first class, second class. The Soviets were saying, well, the old world, and we're the new world. And then Tito's like, yeah, but we're option C. We're going to do our own thing. Then there's a bunch of people that are not connected to any of these. And so the divorced from World I and World II would have been World III, but the completely unattached in Cambodia, they were considered World IV. So the fourth world was arising. And this became something that the Meyer was like, we have to be very careful. We have to control this, or else we won't be allowed to have our free market enterprise. And then economy won't be able to make the real control, because you can vote with your dollar in an economy. And so that's a main connection there. Now, I don't want to go too deep into the church committee hearings, because I'm going to save some church committee hearing stuff for later. Travis said yeet. I do want to play you guys something, and I wonder if this is the point where I'm going to get in trouble. Oh boy. Well, let's just do it, I guess. All right. Well, with all that, guys, I want to again just remind you, Bill Buckley, look at his face, and just understand, like, this is somebody that will come up again. We'll be talking about Bill Buckley more, and we're going to be talking about Snap a bit more, and we'll definitely be talking about Cord Meyer. So let's get Cord Meyer. And his connections to the space program. What is this? This is a whole different Cord Meyer Buckley thing. Yeah, well, we're going to get to the connection with the space program as well when we get to the church committee hearings, and Buckley's book on Hungary and Kazakhstan and the Cosmodrome. So those are all things that are going to come up. Okie dokie day. Let's see.
By other public television stations, and by the following.
We are here to discuss the CIA because all kinds of legislation, A, has been passed, B, is being considered, C, is being debated. By good fortune, Cord Meyer has just published a book. It is called Facing Reality, From World Federalism to the CIA. Cord Meyer, as a young idealist at Yale, sickened by the gruesome war he had just emerged from, resolved to found an organization that would preserve the peace. He called it the United World Federalists, probably the most prestigious young idealistic group of the late 40s. A few years later, disgusted by the disruptive tactics of communists here and abroad, Cord Meyer joined the CIA, rising there to positions of great responsibility, which also involved him in covert action. Also with us today is another former agent of the CIA, Frank Snep. He appeared several years ago on this program to discuss his book, Decent Interval, describing the misbehavior, as he saw it, of the CIA during the closing days of the American presence in Vietnam. There was a heated postscript to the story. Mr. Snep was sued by the CIA for violating a contract which called on him to clear with the agency any book written about it. Mr. Snep's defense was that he violated no national secrets, that he divulged no national secrets. The Supreme Court, ruling in favor of the CIA, said that this was irrelevant. He had broken the contract. Mr. Snep is left financially impoverished, having been required to return all profits from the book to the government. Cord Meyer was born in Washington, and after leaving Yale, did postgraduate work at Harvard. He is the author of Peace or Anarchy, and of numerous articles and short stories. Frank Snep graduated from Columbia and worked for CBS News before going to Vietnam for the CIA. Our examiner is the well-known attorney, Mr. Roy Cohn, about whom more in due course. I should like to begin by asking Mr. Meyer to explain to this audience the restrictions on the CIA recently removed by Congress.
Well, the specific legislation I think you're referring to is the piece of legislation that Carter signed on the 14th of October, which clearly gives to the Senate and House Intelligence Committees the oversight responsibility and removes that responsibility as far as covert action is concerned from the purview of 6 other committees of Congress. So in effect, what has been done is that previously 8 committees of Congress had to be reported to by the President in the event of a covert action project that he was considering. Now 2 remain with that function. And by so doing, I think the chance of leaks has been much reduced. In addition, it's important to point out that the new legislation gives to these 2 intelligence committees full access to all information they may need to conduct their inquiries and to ensure their oversight, so that the American people can now be assured of the fact that there is competent, continuing legislative oversight, which it seems to me, and has always seemed to me, to be the best protection against the abuse of secret power. And I think we're now in pretty good shape on that front as far as the way the Congress and the executive are now coordinated to deal with the difficult problem of secrecy.
In other words, from the point of view of the agency, you have the flexibility under existing legislation that you feel that you need on the covert action front.
I think that by narrowing down the number of committees to only 2, we have, in effect, made it conceivable
Right.
and possible for the president to consider covert action if necessary. Before, I think the president would have been out of his mind to put forward a covert action proposal of any consequence. With 8 committees, their staffs, it added up to over 200 people.
Copy to Michael Harrington, copy
And
to Village Voice,
et cetera. So I think we're in better shape.
Well, let me ask you this. There seems to be a disagreement among people who have studied that piece of legislation over whether the president is obliged to consult with these 2 committees in advance of executing the operation or after it has been executed. Which position do you take?
Well, I think that the language is deliberately ambiguous because what they were trying to do was resolve that ancient constitutional issue. And in effect, the president is committed to reporting in a timely fashion and if possible beforehand. But the language, as I read it, leaves the opportunity for the president in a severe crisis to act and then report.
Besides which he could probably plead the inherent powers of commander-in-chief, might he
That's
not?
possible.
Mr. Knepp, let me ask you this. During the period that you were in the agency that overlapped the Hughes-Ryan Act, was there ever a situation in which that particular law got directly in the way of an operation in which you were engaged?
No, indeed, because Hughes-Ryan was passed in late 1974.
And you around 75.
And I was coming out of the agency in early 1976. I think that Mr. Meyer's description of Hughes-Ryan is a little bit overdrawn. First of all, the Hughes-Ryan amendment mentioned only 2 congressional committees, the House Foreign Relations Committee, Foreign Affairs Committee, and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. It did not prescribe that 8 committees be reported to. That had been part of the tradition, however. In the course of things, one of the committees, the Senate Armed Services Committee, dropped out of the briefing process, and in fact, only a handful of senators and congressmen and only 2 aides were being briefed on covert action by the CIA, even as the controversy swirled about the Hughes-Ryan amendment. So I think it was sort of the controversy about the amendment was very much a red herring, or if you will, a red, white, and blue herring. But in any event, it was grossly
all
overdrawn.
the journalistic literature I've read that describes Hughes-Ryan refers to 8 committees.
Well, it does. Well, 8 committees had been part of, they had retained the oversight responsibility. But in practicality, only a limited number had been receiving, only a limited number of congressmen, as I say, only a few aides, probably no more than 2 had been receiving briefings.
If you're talking about congressional negligence, you're saying something redundant.
Well,
it's a question whether they had statutory authority to require.
Well, they don't have, well, as a matter of fact, the amendment only mentions, again, 2 committees. Now, the important question which you raised in my own context, I think one can address by pointing to the fact that indeed covert action has been carried out, even despite the Hughes-Ryan amendment. For instance, we are supplying, the White House has announced and the CIA has confirmed, the Afghan rebels. And this occurred before the revocation of the Hughes-Ryan amendment.
Well, obviously it's not covert if we've announced it, is it?
Well, I think the White House was trying to make a little political hay with that announcement, trying to make it appear that it was taking a strong stand against the Soviets.
Well, let's agree in any event that somebody thought it was necessary to change the law and did.
That's right.
I think the CIA thought so. It was,
well, so did the Congress. Congress passed the law. But let me get a little bit into your book. I'm very much interested in some criticisms made of your book, Mr. Meyer. And I have in mind Thomas Powers, whose book on the CIA I found extremely interesting. He was on this program a few months ago. But surveying your book, he seems to feel that that your odyssey is really a great act of retrogression, that you began as an idealist and that you end as a kind of a hard bitten apologist for all of the excesses of the CIA, and he makes a couple of rather general charges on which I think people would be interested in hearing your comments. He says the problem seems to be that Mr. Meyer is trying to do too many things at once. Alert us to the communist menace. Well, that is true. That's in the book.
It certainly is.
Say something nice about all those kind people he has met over the years, but presumably you say something nice only about nice people, right?
I would hope so.
Put an ice pick into the ribs of CIA defectors who have spilled secrets for financial and ideological reasons. That's okay by me.
I am critical of those who leak.
Okay. Now this is what especially interests me. Put into his quotes context, parenthesis, which means explain away everything the CIA has been criticized for doing in recent years. Now, what do you understand him to mean by criticizing someone for supplying, as Mr. Snepp did in his book, what you thought to be the necessary context? You can't understand the CIA's role in Chile without understanding the context of that role, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Well, take Chile.
Yeah.
Now, you make a point that in Chile you acted as a civil servant executing the will of the President of the United States, who was acting under statutory authority, right?
Right, exactly.
Now, Mr. Powers then says, why do we have to have a hand in Chile at all? To which you would reply what?
Well, I was confused by that myself when I read it. It did seem to me that I did try to lay forth in the book, starting with 62, the course of American policy and why it evolved. In other words, in 62, the Kennedy administration became convinced on the basis of full and sufficient evidence that the Soviet Union was engaged in massively, secretly supporting the Communist Party of Chile and the alliance between that Communist Party and the Socialist Party of Chile, which was under Allende. In other words, you had a Communist Popular Front, which was being heavily subsidized by the Soviet Union, and which had a chance of winning the Chilean presidential election in '64. And it was for that reason that the Kennedy administration decided to secretly support the Christian Democrats, which were reformist, democratic, and left of center, in an effort to build up that party so as to prevent Chile from becoming another communist satellite.
Okay, stop right there. And answer Mr. Powers' question, are the Chileans too poor to finance their own campaigns or too foolish to direct them? Your answer?
My answer would be that the conservative Chileans were, in fact, comparatively wealthy and quite capable of supporting their political parties, but that the new Christian Democratic Party had very little in the way of a financial base to call on, and that if that kind of reformist party, which was designed to take away the grievances that the communists were working on, was going to succeed, it could only really succeed if it did get some external discrete help.
You see nothing in subsequent circumstances in Chile that requires you to revise this judgment, or do you?
Not at all, because that election was won by a 57% majority by Eduardo Frei, the presidential candidate of the Chilean Communist Party.
Now, the Democrats.
Of the Christian Democratic Party. Now, I do point out in my book that by the time 1970 rolled around, and those elections take place every 6 years, that Nixon, it seemed to me, and I make it clear that I believe so in the book, failed to understand and grasp the importance of a single non-communist candidate to oppose Allende, who was running again. And as a result, the anti-communist parties were split, the Christian Democrats and the nationalists, so that
as they were in Italy in '48.
Yes, and the problem there was let slip to the point where finally Nixon suddenly realized that Allende had a plurality in the actual election that took place in September of '70, and I think he made a signal mistake at that point, in my judgment, in calling on the agency to try to prevent the election of Allende as the president in the Congress, which would then have to decide between the two leading candidates. And he, in fact, called for anything and everything necessary to prevent Allende from coming to power, including a military coup. And that, to my mind, was at that time not likely to be effective, and none of my friends in the agency thought it was likely to be successful either, because the Chilean military were constitutionally minded, and they hadn't yet become convinced that Allende was going to be what he turned out to be.
I think Mr. Power has some difficulty there, because on the one hand, he would vigorously have protested, as all of us know who have read his book, the CIA taking it on its own to defy presidential authority. And on the other hand, he believes that that the president, as you believe, gave
a legal order,
gave the wrong legal and wrong, and misguided instructions.
That's right.
Now, Mr. Snepp, you have no problem, as I understand it from your book, you have no problem with the notion of covert operations.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
And under the circumstances, you would find simplistic the statement by Mr. Powers, are Chileans too poor to finance their own campaigns or too foolish to direct them? The answer is they might be too poor and they might be too foolish, right?
I would find that as simplistic as Henry Kissinger's statement that we can't stand idly by and let the country go communist simply because, or Marxist, he said, simply because they're so irresponsible. That's a statement he made about Chile. I have one question I would like to ask you, which may I intrude?
Sure.
You objected to Track 2, that is the effort to stop Allende's confirmation by the Chilean Congress. And yet you went along with the operation. And you say a lot of other people in the agency objected to it. Why in the world didn't you all band together, hand in hand, and go down to the White House and say, gentlemen, this is not going to work?
Well, Corey did.
Well, Corey was not in the CIA. We're talking about
but Corey,
the people
as
who carried
ambassador.
out,
Well, not only that,
out Track 2.
but Richard Helms, in his discussion with David Frost on this issue, pointed out that he also pointed out to the president and
that it was difficult
at the time that it was not likely to succeed, that he doubted if it could be done, that it was a far out thing that should not be attempted. So that you can carry that just so far.
In your book, you answer the question. This is in a way unfair because I know how you would answer it. You say so. You say that you had too much respect for presidential authority. That, in a way, is the invocation of, I hate to use this hard term, but the Nuremberg defense. Was there no chance that you could have gotten together with your fellows in the agency, behind Helms, gone back to the White House and said, no, we can't do it? That, in fact, this would set in motion a terrible catastrophe, and as indeed you point out.
Well, I think that option is always potentially available, but this was a legal order. This was not an illegal instruction.
No, I understand, and I'm not suggesting it was illegal.
That's a very important distinction to make.
But it is a sensible thing when you're dealing in foreign policy to take a stand somewhere, and quite clearly you felt the thing was unworkable, and a lot of other people did too. So why not?
Well, all I can say is that just what I said in my book, that given those instructions and having argued the case as far as Helms could take it, having explained all the difficulties, having pointed out,
constitutional authority.
I respected the constitutional authority that existed at that time.
If you had found it so morally offensive that you couldn't go with it, you would have resigned.
That's correct.
Well, as a matter of fact, he brings this case up in his book with respect to assassinations. You talk about Lumumba's assassination, the attempts on Castro.
Lumumba was not assassinated by the agency. Please correct me.
I agree, but the point is, in reference to assassinations, you say that you think they're reprehensible, and even if they are ordered by the president, that you think that an agency individual should not go ahead with that. How do you draw these distinctions?
Well, that's a very important distinction. I think that assassination is one, against the American grain. I think two, it's not going to be kept secret in this kind of system that we have, and I think three, that you can't tell whether it's going to work in terms of who might succeed. So that I think morally and practically, it seemed to me that that assassination was out for us.
But surveillance. Surveillance is all right.
Sure.
Even surveillance which skitters along the edge.
I don't see how you can collect intelligence without surveillance.
Talking about surveilling American citizens, which is another case.
Oh, well, no, you weren't. How did we know you was talking about that?
Pardon?
How did we know you was talking about that? You said surveillance.
Well,
why wouldn't we assume we were talking about surveillance as
I agree.
the CIA is directed to do under the charter?
Now, as a matter of fact, that is a gray area, surveillance. And the point I'm trying to get at, or trying to invite you to get at, is how you draw a distinction between assassinations, which might be legally permissible, that is to say, ordered by the president, and assassinations of foreign leaders, and surveillance conducted within the United States by the CIA, which is questionable, although in your book you argue it's not when you have the president saying, march ahead.
Well, now, what kind of surveillance are we talking about?
Well, let's talk about letter opening campaigns, or let's talk about...
Or may I make a suggestion? Suppose the CIA found out, as a result of its operations in Chile, that a member of the Chilean government had instructed agents to recruit somebody to assassinate Letelier in Washington. Would you consider it patriotic for the CIA to have surveyed the potential assassin if, in fact, his identity was known to the CIA, or would you have found this an abuse of authority?
To surveil Letelier?
Yeah, the assassin, the potential assassin.
Well, I think it would have been in the the CIA's...
would you want a neat transposition of power to the FBI under clinical circumstances so as to...
Well, as a matter of fact, one can address that case. The CIA knew that assassins were being directed in the United States by Dina to go after Letelier, and had been dispatched, and George Bush did not inform the proper authorities in the United States of this until after the assassination.
Your point is that George Bush acted properly by adhering strictly to the law that distinguishes between internal and external activity?
Absolutely not, because there is a gray line.
I doubt very much, incidentally, whether what you said is true.
That George Bush withheld the information?
Yes, I doubt very much.
Well, this comes out under the Freedom of Information Act and is reported in both of these two new books on Letelier's...
Has Mr. Bush addressed himself to that issue?
I don't believe...
Don't you think it would be
Bush
fair to
has.
give him a chance?
I can't imagine what his motives would be.
No, none.
Well, in any event, I think it would be most...
He's a very open guy.
That's right.
I think it would be very fair, but at the same time, I'm adverting to information received.
I think we've stumbled as a result of something you said, Mr. Meyer, and also you, Mr. Knapp, into something that's always fascinated me. James Schlesinger, as we all know, who once was the director of the CIA, has come out against any effort to give it a charter. He says it is a misguided quest for moral purity. The comprehensive charter is an idea whose time has passed. The moment you get a charter, you get exegetes. You get the strict constructionist. You get the loose constructionist. So he says you're much better off having a broad idea of what it is that you're supposed to do, and then trying to get people who are well disposed to the values that we believe in, ingenious, tough, docile to the extent that the Constitution requires docility here, but by no means robots. Now, you say certain activities are illegal. Surveillance in the United States might be illegal.
It's possible.
Unless there's a foreign factor, right?
Yeah. It certainly is now.
Assassination is
illegal.
Is illegal. However, there is certainly available to people who have written fiction, or even people who have observed nonfiction, a circumstance in which something is clearly worse than assassination. For instance,
Hitler's.
Well, Hitler would be certainly a good example, but take something less dramatic. Suppose Uganda, under what's his name?
Idi Amin.
Yeah, under Amin, had actually put together, cannibalized an atomic weapon, and in his madness had it all set to go into Tel Aviv, and the only way to stop him would be assassination. It seems to me that the president's problem, if indeed he had to say go or not go, would be a very serious moral.
Sounds to me like it sounds to me like you're beginning to construct the plot of a new book.
Not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea. As a matter of fact, I wrote a book on the subject of assassination and the moral. But my point is that to schematize the responsibilities of the CIA, I think is
I think there's a lot in what Jim Schlesinger said on that point, but I would add two important additional points. One it seems to me that in the new legislation, we have the best kind of assurance against abuse of secret power, and that is the congressional oversight responsibility of the Senate and House Intelligence Committees and their staffs, because they have full access.
Well, that broadens the constituency of the decision, but it by no means invests it with moral. It by no means sacramentalizes it.
No, but
the fact that Tip O'Neill and Howard Baker say it's okay to go shoot him doesn't make the guy who gets shot
I'm not arguing
shot.
that. I'm not arguing that, but it does seem to me that insofar as one is afraid of the agency wielding secret power
it minimizes
on its own,
it minimizes the probability of abuse.
It minimizes the probability of abuse, and therefore, it seems to me, minimizes the necessity for an extensive legal charter of restrictions, as had been proposed.
So therefore, you would not even
I would trade the legislative oversight, and having gotten that, not push for an extensive and specific point-by-point series of do's and don'ts.
Even on assassination?
On assassination, I would go along with that.
Those you would categorically prohibit assassination. I would. So gets off with it, gets his bomb off. Huh?
Well, if you want to draw that extreme case, I'd have to.
Well, as a matter of fact, there is a loophole in the oversight legislation and in the charter legislation still under preparation. The president can exercise his powers as commander-in-chief. That's traditional, and presumably in extreme circumstances, he could take, although I guess one would have to defer to a lawyer for that, but he might be able to take extreme measures to stop that kind of threat.
Could he use the CIA, as you understand it, or would he have to use the armed services?
I would presume the armed services, but the new oversight legislation does acknowledge the president's powers as commander-in-chief, so I think probably the agency is not ruled out as an instrument in that respect. Again, this is all very new territory, and the lawyers and courts have not explored it.
Well, let's take up a question that you address in your book. I think without coming, you do come to firm conclusions about it. On one aspect, you don't. The question of what statutory penalties should be visited on people who break secrets. Now, of course, there are secrets of various kinds.
That's right.
I heard William Colby several years ago say people can go to jail in America for releasing somebody else's income tax. But if they release the identity of a secret agent who then gets shot in Athens, they are subject to no penalties whatsoever. Now, Mr. Colby, having said that, is nevertheless identified with the most permissive wing within the CIA in respect of the transfer. And let's take a concrete case of Mr. Snepp. Do you take the position, you having cleared your book with the CIA before publishing it, do you take the position that the contractual obligations of an agent not to release material that hasn't been reviewed should stipulate that the review is only of sensitive material?
Yes, I clearly take the position that the agency has the right, under the terms of the contract that I signed with it, to request me to provide them with the manuscript to not clear it, but to review it for security matters. And I made it clear in submitting my manuscript that I was quite prepared to change things if it could be shown to me that what I had included would be of real help to the KGB and damaging to our national security. I made it very clear in submitting it that I was not prepared to accept censorship directed at trying to protect the agency against criticism.
But what appeal would you have? Suppose they had said, "Thank you very much, Mr. Meyer. Now we find the whole book offensive."
Well, now this is the
don't publish it.
This is the important point. There is an appeal. I wrote a column actually in which I described how to write about the CIA if you were an ex-CIA man. And there are 3 rules, or at least 2 rules. One, be very careful in your writing your book that you footnote it adequately, heavily, and be very prepared to prove on each page that what you are writing about has been, in fact, put officially into the public domain. And that can only be done by very careful research and footnoting, because
you can't say anything new.
You can't reveal something that hasn't been previously revealed.
Even if it's irrelevant to the scales of war, or
if it is if it is damaging to the national security.
oh, if it is damaging.
That's right.
I'm sorry.
Now, the second thing I tried to point out is that you do have an appeal up the line within the agency. I got, for example, in the first reaction to my book, they pointed out two things, two little paragraphs that they persuaded me quite readily were damaging, and it would help the KGB know something that they didn't already know.
They had a perspective there that you didn't have.
That's right. So I took those out. Then they tried to make some other changes in my book, particularly, strangely enough, in the chapter on the KGB, where I resisted their proposed cuts and appealed up the line to the lawyers.
Sort of an Inspector General type.
That's right. And I warned clearly that I would also go to the courts, and you have an appeal to the federal courts. And the federal courts are in a position to review the decision of the agency and to decide whether, in requesting a particular excision,
it was reasonable and not capricious.
That's right.
And why didn't you exhaust that appeal, Mr. Snapp?
Because the appeals mechanism has only come into being as a result of the litigation that's been directed at me, and he's misstating one's options with respect to the courts. You have to indicate that you are prepared to break the secrecy agreement in order to institute litigation. And all of the court proceedings which might surround your appeal, many of them...
You mean to say they won't exercise jurisdiction unless you say...
that's not true.
There is no... Well, how do you initiate action? You have to go in and say, I don't accept any of your deletions, and I'm going to go into court to challenge you on them. Then the CIA will say, okay, you'll go into in-camera proceedings. The judge is presented with evidence by the experts from the agency to challenge you. There is no way for you to bring in your experts because they're not cleared for classified information or any other information.
But you can serve as your own advocate, can't you?
You can serve as your own advocate,
Of course you
but of course you can what?
Serve as your own advocate.
Do you know that the secret court, which has reviewed requests for warrants, has only turned down one or two requests, and...
You mean only overruled? You mean by turned down overruled the agency?
That's right. And in appeals regarding the Freedom of Information Act, or flowing out of efforts to get information broken out under the Freedom of Information Act, the courts almost always side with the experts. In other words, the CIA.
I didn't find that true in my case. In other words,
Did
I didn't have to go to the court, but I warned that I was prepared. No, not at all. But you see that with the court standing there as a court of last resort, the agency is well aware of the fact, in undertaking its review for security purposes, that you can choose to go that route.
Therefore, they better not be capricious.
They better not be capricious.
Well, but it still is
I found them very reasonable.
It still is a matter of one's putting oneself on the line and saying, I'm not going to abide by this. That's how the litigation is initiated.
Well, if you're not going to abide by it, why bother to go to the court?
Well, I believe in operating within the system of law. That's why I've played out my little adventure in the courtroom. One of the things I wanted to ask you, by the way, I have before me the latest CIA regulations on review and censorship. Have been in existence for a long time. And they both call for review not merely of speeches, not merely of books, nonfiction books, but also newspaper articles, and also novels. And I checked with the CIA, Mr. Buckley, and I've discovered that none of your novels on Blackford Oaks have ever been submitted. You're in violation of your secrecy agreement. And you are in violation for not submitting your newspaper articles. As a matter of fact, that came out in a congressional hearing on March 6, 1980. And the CIA lawyers admitted that you had not submitted any of your newspaper articles relating to the CIA. So both you gentlemen are in violation, and
have you ever heard of de minimis non curat lex?
I'll be glad to.
Meaning the law does not concern itself over trivial matters.
Well, as a matter of fact, it does, because I've been forced to submit a novel to the agency for review.
Yeah, but they don't consider you trivial.
Well, as a matter of fact, that's one of the most pernicious aspects of the whole thing, because the agency has only enforced its regulations against people who've been critical and not against its dear friends. Well, I hate to be considered among the critics because I'm not actually.
I don't see that they've. I don't see that they've had much leverage on Stockman or an AG.
As a matter of fact, they did bring a suit against both Stockwell and Mr. Agee, whom I do not approve of. Yeah. Mr. Agee managed to get off on one argument. Do you know that he was allowed to keep all the profits from his disclosures of classified information? Why? Because his lawyers were able to demonstrate that the agency had applied the rules discriminatorily and had not gone after Mr. Braden or Mr. Cord Meyer or Mr. Buckley.
But why was that defense not available to you?
Because we didn't have proof enough at the time that that was so. But by the time the Agee suit was brought, which was just a few months ago, lawyers had accumulated evidence to indicate
I've never heard of this as a defense. Does this mean that I can tell the cop who stops me for speeding that he didn't stop the other guy for speeding under the circumstances?
Well, if he's only stopping the guys in the blue cars, that begins to raise questions as to whether or not that is merely haphazard.
There's plenty of criticism in Mr. Meyer's book.
As a matter of fact, I went through his book and I found criticism of only 2 CIA people. Actually, I think maybe only one. William Colby, most pronounced criticism of all. And I think
he criticized the whole handling of the Tehran operation, all of the assumptions and misassumptions and so on and so forth.
Well, I think that
it seems to me that
I'm very critical of Admiral Turner, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, sure you are.
I actually called for his
says he should be
replaced.
Well, you said that by 1980 he had been discredited. I happen to agree with you on that, but that was a very soft piece of criticism. I thought it was, I don't mean to be so critical. I thought it was a very good book and a very interesting one.
Which book are you referring to?
I'm talking about yours.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Gosh, I've written a book in which the CIA orders an assassination.
That's right, and you're in violation for all of the Blackford Oaks novels. If you don't believe me, I will be glad to leave you with these regulations. I'd also like to see you.
Well, you can file a brief amicus curiae when they.
I certainly will.
I think that, as a matter of fact, I worked for Howard Hunt. He was my boss, and he wrote novels so rapidly that 2, 3, 4, 5 a year, that Alan Dulles wrote him during the period that I was waiting for him. And he said to him, Howard, they had known each other, look, adopt a pseudonym and never mind submitting them to me because you write them faster than we can review them.
Well, that doesn't work either.
This might interest you.
Well, it doesn't. They say, right in these
and I'll simply trust you not to reveal any national secrets. So I think he picked a pseudonym, I think, of Gordon Marshall. He was. And I should have had a premonition of Watergate because I was visiting him one day when his newest novel had come in. He showed it to me, and there was assignment in Syria by Gordon Marshall. And I flipped through it at the very end and said, "You have just finished another novel by Howard Hunt." I think that a mature organization is intelligent enough to distinguish, or ought to be, between AG-type books and Howard Hunt novels in terms of the probability.
I would have thought so too. I would have thought so too. But the regulations
I also think that the critical datum is, what do you agree to?
Yeah.
If nobody forces you to join the CIA, and if you say, "Look, I won't do this without your permission," it's up to them to waive that rule if they want to. But if they don't want to waive it, it seems to me that you're stuck with your own.
Do you think they've waived the rule in your case?
Well, tacitly, yes.
Why is that? Do you have any idea?
Because they know bloody well that I'm not damaging their interests or the interests.
You mean you're not being critical of their interests, or you're not damaging?
I'm not damaging the national interest.
Well,
in the first place, I was in the CIA for 9 months, 28 years ago, and so the probability the Soviet Union doesn't know what I knew then is slight, unhappily.
Well, as you know, I didn't publish any secret information, nor was I accused of publishing even confidential information.
No.
So we've done. You and I have done the same thing. So I've done the same thing.
No, that's not true, my friend.
But there's also sometimes a case for disciplinary reasons of invoking a rule that is otherwise latent. If everybody said, "I'm going to exercise the same freedom that Frank Snepp exercised," or they might
Mr. Buckley,
they might end up revealing.
Mr. Meyer.
I know.
Well, I don't write in my column about past events that I was privy to and
that you learned as
information. No.
The regulations say that you learn as a result of your CIA experience, or which simply mention intelligence activities.
I don't deal with that kind of information. I'm
pretty
careful. If I have questions about it, I call them up.
I've got four articles that you've written on the CIA which fall within the purview of
not in the judgment of the
secrecy.
agency.
Well, I refer you to the congressional hearings of March.
Well, I
6,
refer you to the fact that they have not called me up about it.
No, but that's a circular argument. He's saying they should have.
Oh, well, maybe they should have, but they didn't.
Well, what Mr. Sneff's case really is that he's being victimized because he wrote a book violating no regulations that you and I haven't regulated, but his was on balance and anti-CIA.
Well, I understand that there's some question about that
in the
also.
opinion of the Supreme Court you have.
Have what?
Violated regulations.
Well, so have you,
violated
under
contract.
that rule.
Violated contract.
So have you under that ruling.
Well, you got to make this de minimis argument. Every speeder is not prosecuted. People who speed recklessly are.
Well, you mean a book that's merely critical of the agency is reckless speeding? That's
well,
the equivalent?
In the view of somebody in the CIA, what you did was contumacious and encourage people in an age of 80s to do things which could very well have disastrous consequences.
I think this is I think you've got your
were
finger on...
Were you involved in the decision to go after him?
No, not at all.
You had left already?
Left the agency. But I think that the important distinction I would make is that unless you have some rule that gives the agency the right to review books that are written about the period of time during which the individual served in the agency and had access to classified information, unless you have that rule, what you're really doing is leaving it up to each individual to make that judgment on his own. And that judgment I found very difficult to make, at least in two cases. In other words, it was pointed out to me that two things that I included that I thought were perfectly harmless could lead the KGB by indirection and induction to know about matters that they didn't know about. And once that was pointed out to me, I was glad to take those out. I think that Mr. Snepp may have substituted his own personal judgment for a judgment, it seems to me, that he was not qualified to make as a single individual.
No, as a matter of fact, I did make the right judgment because I was never accused of
no, but I mean,
any classified information.
But I mean, I think that you are setting up
I made a better judgment than you did in your initial draft. But all of this, I know, is around and around.
No, I think we're right on target. I'm afraid you don't go off this so easily.
Let's consult with our examiner. Mr. Roy Cohn is, of course, one of the best-known lawyers in the United States. He came into prominence as one of the prosecutors of Rosenberg, and then as chief counsel to Senator McCarthy. He has written several books and practices in New York. Mr. Cohn.
I assume the reason for asking me to be examiner today was that you anticipated everyone would need a lawyer at some point during the program. I think the answer to the question we've all been discussing, Mr. Snepp, is there is always an element of discretion, and the de minimis test really does apply. It applies in every agency of government. For example, if somebody takes a deduction on income tax of $2.30, which an agent doesn't like, they're not going to put the person in jail. If it turns into $2 million or something like that, then they are. Whereas you can make an argument there was a violation by the $2.30. So the de minimis argument is good law.
And if it's $2 billion, they'll elect him to Congress.
No question. Now, I want to raise one basic question in listening to you gentlemen. The focus of this whole discussion seems to be, what do we do to put more brakes on the CIA? Are we accomplishing that by this new amendment saying that now we have two committees which have authority over the CIA, and instead of 8 committees, we have 2 committees, but added to that really more teeth to it, because before the president didn't have to go anyplace, supposedly. Now Congress is singling out 2 committees to which he might have to go. My real question is this: isn't the key issue facing the United States now, as we move ahead into the beginnings of a new administration, a look back at what the Senate Intelligence Committee, the Church Committee, did to the CIA and the FBI? And isn't it true that it broke morale, broke their ability to effectively function, and as a result of the authority we gave to the Senate Intelligence Committee to stick its nose that deeply into what the CIA was doing, we helped bring about our own destruction and just denuded the CIA of any strength or ability to protect us, starting with the Ayatollah's journey out of France back to Iran, Secondly, the failure to obtain advance information concerning the seizure of our embassy and the taking of our hostages, who have been there for over a year now. Third, disregarding the intelligence reports clearly given to us by Israel as to what was going to happen. And wouldn't we be a lot better off in this country if a CIA, in good faith, trying to protect our interests under the supervision of a director appointed by and answerable to the President of the United States, who has the inherent powers, was allowed to function in these sensitive areas without a bunch of congressmen and senators?
Without any congressmen or without a bunch of them?
I say without any of them. I'd say without any of them. I'm just saying.
To whom is that question?
Well, I'll direct it to anyone who wants to answer it. And the question is really this: hasn't everything that happened? Hasn't everything that's happened in the last couple of years virtually destroyed what the CIA can do to protect the interests of this country? Iran being my specific case.
Well, now, I would take exception to that. I think the agency is in better shape than it's sometimes seen to be from outside. And I certainly think with the new administration that there's every indication that there will be an effort to increase its reputation and its abilities. I do agree with what you say, much of what you say, about the way Senator Church conducted that inquiry. He began it by announcing that he thought that the CIA might be a rogue elephant out of control. And you have to read the Church Committee report very carefully and come to page 400 and something to find a paragraph which says, in effect, we found no evidence of the CIA ever having done anything that was not properly authorized. So that he reached a conclusion of guilt before the inquiry even began. And the whole tenor of the undertaking was one of trying to get publicity for the worst things that could be pinned on the agency. And they made mistakes even on that field. Because, for example, they found that the letter opening, letters between the Soviet Union and American citizens, was illegal. When the Justice Department tried to determine whether they could indict anybody, they discovered that there was sufficient evidence of presidential authority, including starting with Eisenhower, and they concluded in a very well-written statement of why they didn't prosecute, that the law during the time that mail opening was in operation clearly allowed it to be done.
This was the General.
This was a statement by the Department of Justice given to the press. And I noticed no press coverage on that, incidentally. And this, in effect, took out from under the whole headline that the New York Times ran about massive illegal surveillance. It cut out from underneath that
the word illegal.
The word illegal. An extraordinary thing when you think about it.
We have very much the same situation, Mr. Buckley, with reference to the FBI. We've just had a conviction of 2 top officials of the FBI for pursuing warrantless surveillances of the places where they believed information about these bomb-throwing weathermen was contained. And for having done that, which was an official policy under several presidents and many more attorneys general, 2 of the top former officials of the FBI have just been convicted in a District of Columbia court and face the prospect of going to jail for following an accepted policy in the best interest of this country.
Yeah, but Mr. Meyer's point is that what the CIA was accused of, in the opinion of the Justice Department, was legal.
That's correct.
But it is not being maintained. But a court of law has, at least we haven't subjected it to appellate review, has ruled that what they did was illegal.
And we have the exact opposite situation in the case of the FBI, because a court, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, in the Twang case, held that surreptitious warrantless searches involving national security cases are totally legal, and that evidence obtained, even though there was no warrant, can be used against the defendant in a courtroom. But in the face of that holding, it was the Justice Department that went ahead and prosecuted 2 top FBI officials for doing what a high federal court has said they could do.
So there'll have to be a reconciliation upstairs.
I want to know where that there has to be a reconciliation at some point. Yeah. And the reconciliation I look toward is the national interest. And I'm wondering, on getting you back to Iran again, suppose there had been no church committee, suppose the CIA had been free to operate ordinarily, to ask a very bold question on balance of interest. You say assassination under all circumstances is illegal. Couldn't an awfully strong case be made out for the fact that the assassination of the Ayatollah before he left France would have saved maybe hundreds or thousands of lives and dealt a very strong blow for the free world? Isn't it a balance of interest?
Even if you make the strong case, it doesn't authorize it.
No, and in my opinion, you can't make a very strong case because there are a lot of other Ayatollahs in the wings, and some of them are even worse than Ayatollah Khomeini. But let me, on this Iranian business, because I agree with you that the agency did miss the boat in terms of estimating accurately the extent of the growing opposition to the Shah, and did in fact issue as late as August of '78 a statement, a reassuring statement about how steady his position was. But there was an explanation of that, not an excuse, which most people don't know or understand, and I do mention it in my book. And that is that for about 10 or 12 years, we, the United States, had been terribly dependent on these monitoring sites in the mountains of Iran that looked down onto the Russian testing ranges. And it was through that line of sight monitoring that we were able to get launch phase telemetry that really gave us the specific information that we needed as to the number and weight of the warhead and the missile and the separate warheads.
Making SALT I possible.
Making SALT I possible, so that what happened was that the U.S. government as a whole and the agency as a part of it took it as extraordinarily important to protect the access to those monitoring sites, and in effect did not pursue as avidly and as carefully as they ordinarily would have the opposition to the Shah that was growing, for fear that he might react to any contact that we had with the opposition and cancel access to the monitoring sites. Well, it turns out now we've lost both the monitoring sites and...
But now, wait a minute, are we blaming this on Church?
No, I'm not blaming this on Church. This is an explanation that is unique, in my opinion.
I don't think it's unique at all. As a matter of fact, the House Intelligence Committee has done a study of the Iranian crisis and compared it to the CIA's behavior in the Cyprus crisis and tangentially in Vietnam. And it discovered that one phenomenon was working in all of these different circumstances. It is the nature of the business that when the agency espouses a particular leader, embraces him, holds him up, supports him, it tends to avoid looking at his weaknesses. We did that with Nguyen Van Thieu in Vietnam. We did not involve ourselves with the opposition elements there. We did the same with the Shah. We could not find it in ourselves to look at the opposition, the loyal opposition, or whatever you want to call them.
Did it with Fry in Chile?
We did the same thing in Portugal. As you mentioned in your book, we did not look closely at the opposition elements which were operating.
Well, that was a little bit different.
A very turbulent situation in Portugal.
I think there the fault was, and this is another thing that has to be watched for, and that is that when you have a stable situation over a long period of time, there's a tendency on the part of busy people to look elsewhere and to put their resources elsewhere. And I remember arguing very strongly that we should not close down the Portuguese station. There were those who wanted to close it down because it was such a backwater. But I think, I don't like to claim any kind of foresight, but it was at least clear to me that the Salazar dictatorship wasn't going to last forever, and that we better damn well know what was going on beneath the surface.
But we didn't do it.
That might succeed. And we at least kept the station open, although we didn't do as well as we should have.
In other words, it's something, what I was driving at is not necessarily the congressional investigations, but the nature of the business itself and the way intelligence policy has evolved. Sometimes, particularly in fast-breaking crises, lead us to love what we've created and to embrace our particular client perhaps a little too closely. I think may I go back to your question about the investigations themselves?
Sure.
In your book, I think you point out very cogently that the agency itself laid the ground for those very destructive investigations, and I think they were. I think they did hurt morale, as you suggest, with the family jewels. That is to say, Schlesinger's decision in mid-'73 to dig up all of the agency's wrongdoings and put them in one particular place. William Colby was assiduous in pursuing these crimes, if you want to call them that, and therefore the docket was there. And the only thing that the congressional investigators did was to get a hold of it and play it for everything it was worth. In fact, you point out, and I think it may be true, that most of the family jewels had already been exposed to the agency.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, there's one more thing about that Church investigation. I don't really want to criticize Frank Church so harshly, because after all, he's out of office now.
But I think
but the point
besides it would hurt Dick Helm's feelings.
but no, but the point is that the Church Committee investigation did provide an opportunity to educate the American people in a very serious way, if that opportunity had been taken. In other words, this was a chance to lay on the record what the KGB is, what the opposition is up to, what the real world is like out there. And so much of the Church Committee went forward as if we were living in a perfectly friendly world with no opposition whatsoever. As a matter of fact, you were hard-pressed when reading that report to find any reference to what the Soviet Union is up to in this world. And I think that what could have been a fair, studied, accurate presentation of what we're up against was completely missed.
It led to what Ray Klein calls unilateral disarmament in the intelligence field, which is Mr. Cohn's point.
Yes.
No, I think that's going a little far.
That's going a little far. But certainly it did a lot of damage. There's no doubt about that.
Well,
and it also did damage that we can't estimate, which is the tendency on the part of friendly intelligence services not to give us stuff that they were previously giving us. We don't know how much of that is being held back. We know some is. I know some is.
But a cautionary note, please. Should we tailor our suit to the foreign design? In other words, should we decline? Should we decline to let Congress do what it feels is right, because we may offend some foreign intelligence?
It's a collaborative enterprise. It's one thing for the Israeli intelligence to say, look, we want you to be as let us say, as brutal as we, and we simply decline. It's another thing to say, if we tell you what it is that we know about this international ring, can we safely assume that it's not going to be published in the Village Voice?
Well, I think
those are two different questions.
By the way, not since 1976 has anybody been able to point to a leak from Congress of a major operation. Bobby Inman, head of the National Security Agency, has testified just a few months ago that it is the executive branch that tends to leak secrets.
Who leaked the Angola operation?
Which that was in 1976.
Yeah.
Well, late 75.
I've corrected your chronology.
Well, no, I think the Pike Committee was very irresponsible. I'm talking about the two permanent oversight committees.
Well, I'm talking about a separate congressional leak on the Angola operation.
Well, may I also suggest that there may be nothing to leak, i.e., if I'm afraid of leaks and therefore I decide to do nothing, there's nothing for you all to leak, right? So the question is, how many good ideas were aborted as a result of a fear of leaks?
Well, here's one very specific one.
We have 45 seconds.
Oh,
go ahead.
No, I do feel that President Carter had an opportunity in January of '79 to get Somoza out of Nicaragua and to have a democratic, reform-minded, non-communist regime take over. And if he had been willing to undertake at that time the kind of covert action that could have done it, I think we wouldn't be facing this Sandinista crowd the way we are now.
With that concrete example, I thank Mr. Cord Meyer, the author of Facing Reality, From World Federalism to the CIA, Mr. Frank Snepp, Mr. Roy Cohn, and gentlemen from the Bergen Catholic High School. Thank you.
Not bad. All right, so I'm not gonna go too much further because I got another show coming up after this. We're gonna do Venice Beach Dub Club is coming on. Seth from VBDC on Instagram, who I've done a lot of shows on Instagram with. We'll be here and we'll be talking a bit about Ethiopia and about Rastafarianism and the world in general. So that'll be cool. And that's another thing that's going to start coming up in our history series is talking about Ethiopia, because we've been talking about the monarchies, and it's very important to recognize how the monarchies work and why they had to recognize Ethiopia and Haile Selassie. I do want to show you some more things really quickly. The guy who was talking in that video, besides Cord Meyer and Frank Snepp, was Roy Cohn, and you saw Bill Buckley, and I told you how much I think he's great. But so you got the point. Frank Snepp, a CIA agent who had written a bunch of stuff, and if you go back further to his North Carolina roots, you might find some interesting things, and all the way back to the Civil War in his family. So there's something there. But Roy Cohn was a political fixer, right? right? And a fixer is a person who carries out assignment. He solves problems. You know what I'm saying? You know, he's just a fixer. And he was good friends with important people. There's him with McCarthy. And eventually you see him, you know, with Trump. And that's something that has come up. FBI releases files on President Trump's late lawyer, Roy Cohn. Beautiful man, right? So there's some important stuff that connected. It's amazing. That video is interesting, in my opinion, all these things that are connecting it. But you can also see what he's talking about is that the FBI had access to things that the CIA were all of us not allowed to do. So the FBI becomes more important. But the FBI, we all know, J. Edgar Hoover. Let's go back. J. Edgar Hoover was in, you know, besides wearing dresses, he loved Mormons and clean-cut kids working for the FBI who stuck out too much for the CIA. Because, you know, a tall, blonde, clean-cut kid, it's like that movie Triple X. It just doesn't work. So, but there was a point when Ezra Taft Benson, who was the president of the church, right? Yeah, 13th president of the Church of Latter-day Saints, and also under Eisenhower was the Secretary of Agriculture. And this is your connection to how a lot of Mormons got, you know, the Brigham Young University got their way into, you know, the FBI, but eventually into the CIA. And they make great CIA recruits, and you saw that whole connection there. But they were great for the FBI first. And then they end up getting into the CIA. So there's a lot to that as well. That's the big transition period, and you can see the difference in the WASPs, which is something they were talking about, how things changed and how they started recruiting Midwesterners and even people from LA, you know, and things like that. But also how the FBI, and this is the point when the FBI gets into the mafia and all that stuff. Okay, I think that covers most of the things I wanted to cover for today. Guys, I wanted to thank you again, Sticky Marks, for the 10 pounds. Katie, thank you also. Bo, thank you. And yeah, guys, I just appreciate that you're here. Let's just, you know, keep it up. And tomorrow I'll continue on. I might talk about the church committee hearings. It's just a big piece. So but you saw how important it is to them. They're like, that's all they can think about. And you're like, what is this? You know, so the church committee hearings is very important. We're going to cover that, and the World Federalists. That's going to also require talking about the Monroe period in the United States, right? So you have to think about the Monroe Doctrine. So there's a lot there. And Britain and Peabody and the bank. So there's a lot we can cover. So thanks a lot. I'll talk to you soon. And like and subscribe. Go to andreas.me or exertus.com to donate directly. And I appreciate those of you who already did. And buy some t-shirts. All right, well, take care of yourself, everybody.
Hey, everybody, tune in to Recent Tartarian.
Recent Tartarian. Recent Tartarian. Tartarian. Recent Tartarian. Recent Tartarian.
Hey, everybody, tune in to Recent Tartarians.
Recent Tartarians. Recent Tartarians.